I had always dreamed of getting away from the noise of the city, escaping to some isolated cabin in the woods where I could think, relax, and recharge. It had been a stressful year with work and personal issues, and I thought a quiet weekend would be just what I needed. I spent hours researching cabins for rent online, looking for something secluded and peaceful. Finally, I found the perfect place. A small cabin in a remote area of the forest. It looked cozy and private, nestled between towering trees with no neighbors for miles. I booked it right away. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, with the road slowly narrowing as I got farther from civilization. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out much of the sun. The air was crisp and fresh, a sharp contrast to the city's pollution. By the time I finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. It was everything I had hoped for. Small, rustic, and surrounded by wilderness. It was the perfect getaway. The cabin itself was charming. It had a wooden exterior with a porch that wrapped around the front. The inside was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a living area with a couch and a couple of chairs. There was a loft bedroom above the main floor. I unpacked my things, set up the small space, and made myself comfortable. The first night was quiet. It was just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt at peace. That first night, I went to bed early, wanting to rest and unwind. But sometime around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint sound. It was a noise that didn't seem quite right. Something soft, almost like a tapping. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound came from outside. I waited, listening, but it didn't come again. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, messing around near the porch. I tried to go back to sleep, but something about the noise stuck with me. The next morning, I brushed off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was being silly. I made a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, taking in the view. The air was cool, the forest around me dense and still. It was beautiful. There was no sign of anyone nearby, and the silence was only broken by the occasional bird call. I spent the day hiking around the property, exploring the nearby trails, and trying to clear my head. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed the area around the cabin felt more and more isolated. It wasn't just that it was far from town. It felt like it was deliberately hidden, as though it had been chosen for its seclusion. I had no idea who owned the land around it, but there was something about the way the trees grew in thick clusters, making it difficult to see far into the distance, that made me feel like I was being watched. That night, I tried to put the previous evening's weird noise out of my mind, but when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I heard it again, a soft, irregular tapping, this time louder and more distinct. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woods. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing more rhythmic as if someone were knocking on the walls. I felt my heart rate spike. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and carefully walked to the back door, my mind racing. I opened the door slowly, scanning the porch and the surrounding area. Nothing, just the trees, the dark night, and the unsettling silence. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. There was no sign of anyone. I thought maybe the wind was causing the sound, but something didn't sit right. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any footprints or signs of movement, but the ground was hard, covered in a layer of dry leaves that hadn't been disturbed. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was overreacting and went back inside. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I had a headache, and my mind felt foggy, like I hadn't slept at all. I went through the motions of making breakfast, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. I decided to head into town to grab some supplies. I needed a change of scenery, something to break the tension. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints leading up to the front porch. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but upon closer inspection, they weren't. They were fresh, as though someone had walked up to the cabin while I was asleep. I froze for a moment, my stomach tightening. I walked around the cabin to see if the prints continued, but they stopped at the front door. No one was there now, but it was clear that someone had been. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, even though I knew I had locked them the night before. Everything seemed fine, but the feeling of being watched was more intense now. I didn't want to stay in the cabin anymore, but I also didn't want to leave. I had already come so far, and part of me didn't want to let fear control me. I decided to go into town as planned, to clear my head. The town was small, just a few buildings scattered along the main road. I grabbed a few supplies, trying to shake off the creeping feeling that had followed me from the cabin. As I was leaving the store, I ran into a local man who seemed friendly enough. We exchanged a few words, and he asked where I was staying. I told him about the cabin, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He quickly followed up with, that place. The owner's a bit strange. He doesn't like visitors up there. You might want to be careful." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to be funny, but the look on his face told me there was more to it than that. He gave me a long, lingering look before saying, "You're not alone up there, are you?" Then he turned and walked away without waiting for a response. The rest of the day felt off. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's comment. The idea that the cabin's owner might be watching me made my skin crawl, but I pushed it aside. I was just being paranoid. I needed to focus on relaxing and enjoying the peace I had come for. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the unease hit me again. There was no one around, and the night was still, but something felt wrong. I couldn't place it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. The next few days passed in a blur of strange occurrences. I'd find small things out of place. A chair moved slightly, a door left ajar, the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin in the middle of the night. But when I'd go outside to investigate, there was never any sign of anyone. Still, the sense of being watched never left. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, on the last night, it all came to a head. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book when I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were heavier, more deliberate, coming from the woods just outside the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped when I stepped out onto the porch, but I knew someone was out there. I shone the light into the trees, scanning the shadows, but there was no one. I stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath my boots. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching me. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It just stood there, blending in with the darkness, its outline barely distinguishable from the trees behind it. I don't know what made me do it, but I took a step toward it. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I forced myself forward, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, the figure suddenly turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, the silence of the night closing in around me. It was then that I realized I had never been alone in that cabin. The owner had been watching me, perhaps even coming around every night, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, no longer caring about the peaceful retreat I had come for. I didn't want to stick around to figure out who this man was or what his intentions were. I left the cabin behind, driving away as fast as I could, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I never went back to that cabin. I still don't know who the man was or why he was watching me. All I know is that I got lucky, and I got out before things could go any further. It was one of those trips where you're supposed to get away from everything. No work, no stress, just a little peace and quiet out in the woods. I had been craving it, honestly, because life had gotten a little too hectic. A week in a cabin, just me and the quiet of the trees. A chance to breathe again. The cabin was small, nothing fancy, just a little one-room place with a stone fireplace and a creaky front porch. It was off the grid, too, deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. A place where the only sound was the wind and the rustling of leaves. Perfect escape. I had been planning this for months, wanting to disconnect from everything. I packed up some basic supplies, food, my gear, and a few books, and drove out on a Friday morning. The road leading up to the cabin was bumpy, rough, just the way I liked it. It was a good few hours of driving before I reached the place, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already sinking low. The last bit of the drive had been down a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the woods, and I had to drive with my lights on full to see where I was going. The air was chilly, even though it was still early autumn, and the smell of pine filled the air as I unloaded my stuff. The cabin itself was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. A small creek ran along one side of the clearing, its sound steady and calming. The kind of place that felt like it could have been untouched for decades. I locked my car and made my way inside. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing the bare essentials inside. Just a simple bed, a kitchen area, and the fireplace. It had a rustic charm to it. I spent the evening unpacking and settling in. I made a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. The cabin had electricity, but it was minimal, just enough to power a few lights and the fridge. After dinner, I sat on the front porch with a drink in hand, watching the last bits of sunlight fade behind the trees. It was peaceful, way more peaceful than I'd expected, honestly. No noise, no people, just the sounds of the forest. As the darkness settled in, the temperature dropped, and I decided to get some sleep. I had a fire going in the fireplace, and the warmth filled the room, making the air inside feel a little more comfortable. The bed was small but cozy, and I could hear the wind howling outside as I lay there, drifting off. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, made some coffee, and went outside to stretch my legs. The forest looked different in the daylight, more alive. The trees towered above me, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I decided to take a walk, just to explore the area. There were a few trails around the cabin, and I followed one that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. For hours, I wandered through the forest, listening to the occasional bird or rustling of leaves underfoot. I didn't see much wildlife, just the occasional squirrel or rabbit darting between trees. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own thoughts. The kind of silence you rarely get when you're surrounded by other people. As the sun started to dip again, I made my way back to the cabin. I felt a sense of calm, like everything was just as it should be. That evening, things started to feel different. The air felt thicker, and the wind had a strange edge to it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the chill of the evening. But as I sat on the porch, I noticed something that made me uneasy. A noise in the distance. It wasn't the normal forest sounds. Nothing like the birds or squirrels I'd heard earlier. It was a low, gruff growl, distant but still clear. I froze, listening. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a dog's growl, but deeper, more guttural, like it was coming from something bigger than just an animal. I told myself it was probably just a coyote or something. After all, there were a lot of wild animals in these parts. But the sound wasn't right. It kept going, and I couldn't help but feel a prickle of fear along the back of my neck. It wasn't normal. The growl stopped after a few minutes, and I figured it was just some wild animal moving on. I went back inside and locked the door, feeling a bit foolish for getting spooked. The wind picked up again, and I turned on the lights in the cabin. The fireplace crackled, and I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to get some sleep, but every little sound outside seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, the creaking of the cabin, and even the sounds of the creek were unnerving. At some point, I must have drifted off, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. The next day, I decided to stick closer to the cabin, figuring that maybe I was just overtired or imagining things. I spent the day inside, reading and cooking, just keeping myself busy. But the strange feeling lingered, like I was being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, looking into the trees, but never saw anything. Yet, something told me I wasn't alone. That evening, as the sun began to set again, I noticed something odd. The area around the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. The wind had died down, and even the normal rustling of the trees seemed to stop. It was too quiet, I couldn't even hear the creak anymore, which was unusual. I stood up and went to the window, peering outside. It was hard to see much with the low light, but I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or a bear, but the shape didn't seem right. It was too tall, too lanky. I couldn't make out any details, but my gut told me something was off. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, determined to figure out what was going on. I moved slowly, staying close to the cabin, scanning the area with the light. My heart was pounding as I stepped into the clearing, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I moved deeper into the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just at the edge of the trees, barely visible, stood a figure. It was tall, at least 7 feet. Its shape was hunched, almost like it was crouching, but its posture was unsettlingly unnatural. The thing had the body of a man, but its limbs were too long, too thin. Its fur was matted and dark, and its face, if you could call it a face, was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out glowing eyes. It was staring directly at me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it made a low growling sound, the same sound I had heard the night before. It was louder now, closer, more menacing. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature didn't move, but its eyes never left mine. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, stumbling over rocks and branches in the dark. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against the door, breathing heavily. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something in between, something not quite right. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the noises outside stopped. I didn't hear anything else. No growls, no movement, just silence. But I didn't dare go back outside to check. I stayed up for hours, just watching the door and waiting for something, anything, to happen. By morning, I was exhausted, but the creature, whatever it was, hadn't returned. The sun had risen, and everything seemed normal again. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes after something has happened, something that shouldn't have. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that cabin. My hands shook as I loaded my car, and I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they say? I didn't know what it was, only that it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. I didn't go back to that cabin. Couldn't. The woods felt wrong now, haunted by something I didn't understand, something I didn't ever want to see again. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel like the thing, whatever it was still watching me, still out there, lurking in the trees. I had always dreamed of owning a cabin in the woods, a place to get away from the chaos of life and reconnect with nature. So when I finally found one for sale in a remote area, I didn't hesitate. The price was surprisingly low, and the listing didn't mention anything particularly strange about the place. It was a small cabin, a bit worn but charming in its own way. I could already imagine how peaceful it would be to spend weekends there, away from work and the noise of the city. The cabin was located on a piece of land far from the nearest town. It was nestled among tall, dense trees, with only one dirt road leading in. The isolation felt comforting, almost like I was the only person on Earth. The cabin itself was older, but the structure seemed solid. The roof had a few patches, and the paint on the walls was peeling in some places, but that only added to the rustic charm. The first few weeks after I bought the cabin were perfect. I'd spend the days outside, clearing the yard, chopping wood, and getting the place ready for winter. I spent nights by the fire, reading or just enjoying the silence. It was everything I'd imagined, and I was content. But then, something strange happened. I don't know exactly when I started to notice, but there was an odd smell in the cabin one morning. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there. I couldn't place it. Something earthy, almost metallic. At first, I thought it was just old wood or maybe something in the plumbing. But it stuck around, getting worse over time, until it became impossible to ignore. I decided to investigate. I checked the attic, thinking maybe there was some kind of rodent infestation. The attic was accessed by a small pull-down ladder that creaked every time it was used. When I climbed up, the air felt musty and cold. I flicked on the light, scanning the dim space. There were old boxes stacked up in corners, cobwebs in the rafters, and a layer of dust on everything. Nothing unusual. But then something caught my eye. There, half hidden under some old blankets, were what looked like human bones. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but when I moved closer, I saw them clearly. A skull still attached to a few pieces of a spine, some ribs scattered around it, and a few other bones I couldn't immediately identify. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These were human remains. I froze. My heart raced in my chest, and my mind scrambled for an explanation. How could this be? Why were there bones in my attic? I stepped back, my legs shaking. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a sick joke or something left behind by the previous owner, but that didn't make sense. No one would leave human bones just lying around in an attic. I ran down the ladder and immediately called the police. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone, but I managed to explain what I had found. The operator was calm but serious, asking me not to touch anything and to wait for officers to arrive. I sat outside the cabin, my mind racing. The isolation that had once felt comforting now seemed oppressive, suffocating. What had I gotten myself into? It took a while for the officers to arrive, but when they did, they immediately took control of the situation. They asked me to stay outside and wait, which I did without question. The police went in, their footsteps muffled by the thick walls of the cabin. I could hear them talking to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. The officers stayed inside for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, they emerged, one of them walking straight up to me. He had a grim expression on his face, and his eyes were filled with a kind of disbelief that I couldn't understand. He told me that the bones were indeed human, and they had likely been there for a long time. They asked if I knew anything about the previous owners, and I told them I didn't know much, just that the cabin had been vacant for years before I bought it. They brought in more officers and started to search the cabin more thoroughly. It didn't take long for them to find something else. In the crawl space under the cabin, they found more bones. Some of them still partially covered in dirt, others stacked in a neat pile. The officers were quiet as they worked, and I could see their faces tightening with the realization that this wasn't just some strange accident. This was something darker, something sinister. One officer, a woman with short brown hair, came over to me and told me that they had already contacted the coroner. She explained that they would be taking the bones to the lab to determine how long they had been there and whether there were any other clues. She didn't say much else, but the look in her eyes was enough to tell me that they suspected something terrible had happened here. The police left a few officers behind to secure the cabin and continued their investigation. I didn't know what to do. I was still reeling from the discovery. How could this be? Was I somehow involved in something illegal without even knowing it? Was this cabin some kind of hidden crime scene? A few days passed, and the police continued their investigation. They took the bones away, and I didn't hear from them for a while. I spent most of that time in a daze, unable to shake the image of the bones in the attic from my mind. I couldn't believe that I had been living in a place where something so horrifying had happened. Finally, a detective came to speak with me. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a suit even though it was clear he wasn't here for a casual chat. He told me that they had managed to identify the bones. Most of them belonged to a man who had gone missing about 5 years ago. They also found traces of a woman's remains in the same area. He explained that the previous owner of the cabin had been questioned, but he had denied any involvement. However, the detectives were certain now. The previous owner, a man named Walter Green, had been running some kind of illegal operation. He had a history of criminal activity, and it seemed that he had used the cabin for something far worse than just a weekend retreat. Green had been arrested for a string of other crimes, and the police suspected that the bones in my cabin were the result of a dark and twisted history of violence. It turned out that he had been involved in human trafficking, and the cabin had been used to store victims before they were transported elsewhere. The police had been investigating him for months, but the discovery of the bones in my cabin was the break they needed to bring him down for good. As the police wrapped up their investigation, they made it clear that I was not involved in any way. The bones had been there long before I ever set foot in the cabin. But that didn't make me feel any better. The thought that I had been living so close to something so monstrous haunted me for weeks. I sold the cabin soon after. The memory of the bones in the attic was too much to bear. It wasn't the dream getaway I had imagined. It was a place tainted by the horrors of the past. I couldn't bring myself to stay there any longer, not even to collect the things I had left behind. The land was cursed in some way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of those past events lingered in the air, invisible but ever-present. The police eventually arrested Walter Green, and he was convicted for his role in the crimes. But it didn't bring me peace. I still think about the cabin sometimes, the smell of decay in the attic, the bones I found, and the terrible history that had been hidden away there for so long. It's a chapter of my life I wish I could forget, but one that will haunt me forever. It was just supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I had been planning it for months, dreaming about the quiet, the isolation, and the chance to clear my head. A little cabin, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Just me, the forest, and the wind through the trees. No one to bother me, nothing to distract me. I could finally take a break and get away from everything. I found the cabin online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small structure tucked deep in the woods, off the beaten path. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. I liked the idea of it. No neighbors, no traffic, just nature and all the time in the world to enjoy it. When I first got there, the place was more isolated than I expected. The cabin was old but solid, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams overhead, and windows that looked out over the forest in every direction. There was a small porch with a swing, perfect for watching the sunset or just enjoying the breeze. I didn't mind the few creaky floorboards or the old smell that lingered in the air. Things like that didn't bother me. I unpacked, set up my things, and then took a long walk around the property, exploring the woods that stretched on forever in every direction. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional bird call, and my own footsteps. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. No distractions, no stress, just the natural world, undisturbed. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace and sat in the armchair by the window. I hadn't expected to feel uneasy, but as the sun sank behind the trees, the world outside started to feel different. It wasn't a sudden shift, just a creeping sensation that settled over me. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by so much dark, dense forest. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when you're far away from civilization. The fire crackled, and I tried to push the feeling aside. I had brought some books, a journal, and a few movies to pass the time. But every time I settled in, I found myself looking out the window, peering into the blackness beyond. The trees looked different in the dark, their long shadows stretching out like fingers, reaching into the night. It was like the forest was alive, breathing, moving in subtle ways that I couldn't quite place. I tried to sleep that first night, but the creaking of the cabin kept me awake. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound started to feel too deliberate. There were footsteps outside, quiet, but distinct, shuffling around the cabin like someone was walking slowly in the yard. My heart raced, and I pressed my back into the mattress, trying to stay as still as possible. The footsteps came and went, and then I heard the faint sound of something scratching against the walls. I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't sound like an animal, but at the same time, it didn't sound like a person either. The wind could play tricks on you, sure, but this felt too real. It was the kind of thing that could make your skin crawl if you listened too long. I got up and checked the locks on the door and windows. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, By the time morning came, the air felt heavy with silence. It was like the entire world was holding its breath. I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, this place was isolated. There was no one for miles, no one who could have made those sounds. And yet, deep down, I wasn't so sure. I spent the next day hiking, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The trees were thick, the forest dense and quiet. But even out there, it didn't feel the same. Felt too still. The birds weren't singing as much. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching through the underbrush, the occasional rustle in the leaves, and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. It was unnerving, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. I built another fire, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept the doors and windows shut tight, even though the heat from the fire made the cabin feel stuffy. My nerves were on edge. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind, the crackling of the fire, the occasional squeak of the cabin settling. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something watching me from the dark, just beyond the tree line. But when I looked, all I saw was blackness. That night, the noises came again. This time, there were no footsteps, just a soft tapping, like something was knocking at the door. Not a loud bang, but a quiet, insistent rapping. I froze, my pulse racing in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The knock came again. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the front door or the side of the cabin, but it was close, too close. I wanted to get up, to check the door, to see if someone was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something inside me told me that if I did, I wouldn't like what I found. The tapping stopped after a while, but I still couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, person, or something else entirely? I stayed awake, listening, watching, my eyes darting around the cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light casting flickering shadows across the room. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the cabin felt different, felt emptier somehow. The silence was even heavier than before. I made breakfast, forcing myself to stick to my routine, to do something normal, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, like someone or something was always just out of sight. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I read, I hiked, I tried to enjoy the stillness of the place. But by the time the sun started setting, I knew I couldn't stay another night. The noises, the sense of being watched, the unnatural quiet, it was all too much. I packed my things, ready to leave, but as I started to head out the door, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, just outside the window, in the growing darkness, I saw a figure standing by the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, slow, deliberate steps, the shape tall and dark against the forest backdrop. I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was unmistakable. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something far more menacing. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and I ran to my car. The headlights cut through the dark as I sped down the narrow dirt road, my heart hammering in my chest. As I left the woods behind me, I didn't look back. The cabin, the forest, everything I'd felt in those few days stayed with me long after I was gone. Looking back now, I still don't know what it was. I never found any tracks or signs of anyone being out there, but I know what I saw. And the feeling that something was watching me, that's something I'll never forget. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks or if there was something more to it, but I do know that I'll never go back there again. The woods are beautiful, but sometimes the silence is the loudest thing of all, and the things hiding in it, better left undisturbed. I've always loved my cabin. It's tucked away in a small, isolated area in the woods, far from the noise and clutter of city life. For me, it's always been a sanctuary, a place to get away from the world and recharge. My family built it years ago, and ever since, I've spent countless weekends there. I love the solitude, the quiet mornings, and the peaceful evenings. There's something calming about being surrounded by nature, hearing nothing but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant call of wildlife. But for all the comfort it brings, there are times when the isolation feels heavier, and the woods seem less like a sanctuary and more like a vast, looming presence. I'd been there alone for a few days. It was just the right kind of trip, peaceful, restful, with no distractions. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground as I made myself dinner in the cabin's small kitchen. The air was crisp, typical for the fall, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. It felt good to be away from everything. I sat down at the small wooden table, eating my meal, listening to the soft sounds of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. After I finished eating, I washed up the dishes, making sure to keep the kitchen clean. The evening was still, and the air outside was starting to cool. I went to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. The shadows were long now, stretching far across the yard, and the night sky was clear, with just a few stars visible through the branches. There was something about that kind of silence, the kind that wraps around everything like a heavy blanket. It wasn't unnerving, but it made me feel aware of everything, like I could hear every twig snap or leaf fall. I decided to get some firewood. It wasn't too far from the cabin, maybe 100 yards, but the woods were dense, the kind of forest where the trees felt thick enough to swallow up any sound. As I walked out, the smell of pine and damp earth hit me. The ground was soft underfoot, the leaves and moss giving way slightly with each step. I made my way to the woodpile, which was tucked between two large oak trees. I grabbed a few logs, stacking them carefully in my arms. The woods were oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of everything. I felt the weight of each log, but more than that, I felt the weight of the night pressing in. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant animal calls. It felt like everything had gone still, and I didn't like it. I turned to head back to the cabin when I heard something. It was faint, at first, like a low murmur that didn't belong. I froze. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, just the sense that there was something out there. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or something small, but the longer I stood there, the more the feeling gnawed at me. I took a few steps back toward the cabin, but my mind wouldn't let me shake the feeling. Something was off. I looked around, scanning the trees. There was nothing, just darkness and shadow. The silence wrapped itself tighter around me. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was nothing. But that feeling, like someone was watching me, clung to me. I quickened my pace, hurrying back to the cabin. But when I reached the door, I didn't immediately go inside. I stood there for a moment, staring into the woods. That's when I heard it again. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking, but the sound was too loud, too close. My heart jumped, and I instinctively took a step back, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I listened, my breath catching in my throat. It was quiet again, too quiet. I didn't know if I should go inside or investigate, but the urge to find out what had made that noise was overpowering. I stepped out into the yard again, trying to remain as calm as I could. My eyes swept the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The sound hadn't been close enough to be a threat, but I knew something was there. I felt it. I decided to make my way around the cabin, keeping an eye on the woods as I walked. I didn't have a weapon, nothing more than a small pocket knife that I always carried with me. Not much for defense, but it made me feel a little safer. I reached the back of the cabin, where the woods were thickest. The only light came from the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the forest floor. There was a clearing ahead, and as I made my way toward it, I noticed something. Footprints, fresh ones. The earth was soft here, and there were clear impressions of shoes, boots most likely. They were large, heavier than my own. I felt my stomach drop. These were human tracks. I stood frozen, trying to calm myself. It didn't make sense. My nearest neighbors were miles away. No one came to visit, and there were no signs of anyone being here before. I crouched down, examining the prints. They seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I considered following them, but every instinct in my body told me that was a bad idea. I had no idea who or what had left them, and the fact that they were so recent made everything worse. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the tracks, until I reached the cabin again. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. For the first time that night, I felt real fear creeping in. The silence that had been so peaceful earlier was now suffocating. It was too quiet. I lit the fireplace again, hoping the warmth and the crackling fire would calm me down. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening. Every small sound outside, the wind shifting the trees, a twig snapping, made my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I decided to go to bed, pulling the thick quilt over myself. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise kept me awake. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything, that would explain the unease gnawing at me. I don't know how long I lay awake before I heard it. A knock, faint at first but unmistakable. A single, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Came again, this time louder. Someone was knocking on the cabin door. I didn't move, couldn't. I lay there, listening to the soft, steady knocks, my breath shallow. It wasn't a casual knock. It wasn't a neighbor or someone lost in the woods. It felt purposeful. I didn't have a phone with me. There was no reception out here. I was completely isolated. The knocking stopped suddenly, and all I could hear was my own breathing. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. I debated going to the door, but every part of me screamed not to. I didn't want to see what or who was on the other side. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep. Morning came eventually, and I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, peering out the windows, but the forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The footprints were still there, deep in the woods, but I didn't go out to check again. I packed up quickly. I didn't bother staying another night. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me. I didn't tell anyone about the knocking or the tracks. I didn't think they'd believe me, and part of me wasn't sure I believed it either. But I never went back to that cabin alone. Not after that. The woods, which once felt like home, now seemed like a place I'd rather avoid. And every time I think about it, I still feel that lingering unease, as if something is out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off, My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I always looked forward to my time at the hunting cabin. It wasn't much, just a small structure tucked away deep in the woods, but it was mine. I'd built it myself, piece by piece, taking years to get it to a point where I could spend time there without feeling like I was slumming it. It was rustic, with rough-hewn timber walls and a small, sturdy fireplace that kept the whole place warm during the colder months. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air whenever I opened the door, a reminder that this place was my retreat, far from the noise of everyday life. The cabin was nestled in the middle of a thick forest, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the sky, blocking out much of the sun during the day. The only way to get there was through a rough, winding dirt road that took a good hour to drive. There was no one around for miles, and that was exactly how I liked it. Most of the time, I'd come up here alone. It was a place to clear my head, think, and if the mood struck me, hunt a little. No pressure, just peace. I'd been up there for about a week, enjoying the solitude when things started to feel different. It started with small things. Noises I couldn't quite place, branches cracking when the wind wasn't blowing, and the odd sensation that I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. You get jumpy when you're alone for too long, right? It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The first night I heard something unusual. I was sitting in front of the fireplace, flipping through an old hunting magazine. The night was still, and the air was crisp, with a slight chill creeping in from outside. The cabin creaked and groaned as it always did, but something felt off. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence, coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to repeat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I grabbed my rifle and quietly walked to the window. I peered through the thick curtains, but all I could see was the dark expanse of trees and the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the leaves. Nothing. I stood there for a few minutes, straining my eyes, but the forest remained still, quiet. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging around. I sat back down, but the unease didn't leave me. I tried to focus on the fire, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to shake off that feeling. The woods were my domain. I knew every trail, every bend, every ridge. But as I walked, something felt off. The air was thicker, the silence louder. I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt, large and wide, unlike any animal I'd ever seen before. They didn't look like deer tracks or bear prints. They were too deep, too wide. I crouched down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing the earth. The prints were recent and they led deeper into the woods. I didn't like the direction they were going. Still, I followed them, though every step I took felt heavier, like the forest was pushing against me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching. The tracks led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't been to in years. The trees around it were thick, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The clearing was quiet, eerily so. In the center of the clearing, I found something strange. A small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves, arranged in a way that didn't look natural. It looked too deliberate, too out of place in the middle of the woods. My pulse quickened as I examined it. Whoever had built this shelter knew what they were doing, and they hadn't gone far. I didn't stay long. Primal instinct kicked in, telling me to get back to the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around, suddenly aware that I was no longer alone. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by the rush of blood in my ears. I walked faster, almost running, until I finally broke through the trees and saw the familiar outline of my cabin. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I noticed something else. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my stomach twist. I hadn't left it open. I hadn't even gone near it. My rifle was still strapped to my back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was now inside my cabin. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The cabin was still, but there was something different about it. The air felt thick, charged with tension. My eyes scanned the room, taking in everything. The fire was out, the logs in the hearth cold and lifeless. Everything seemed untouched, but something wasn't right. It was too quiet. I moved towards the back of the cabin, where the small window faced the woods. The curtain was drawn back slightly, just enough for someone to peek through. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left the curtain like that. I was sure of it. I checked the rest of the cabin, moving quickly from room to room. Nothing had been disturbed, but the unease continued to grow. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being hunted, like the cabin was no longer my safe haven but a trap. That night, I kept the lights off, the door locked, and my rifle close. The fire was out, but I didn't dare try to light it again. Couldn't relax. I kept hearing things, scratching at the door, soft footsteps just outside the window. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd freeze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. But it was always silent when I checked. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. My mind was a blur of exhaustion and fear, but I had to get out of there. I packed my things, making sure to keep my rifle close. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a brief sense of relief. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and the woods seemed almost peaceful again. I made it to the truck without incident, but as I drove down the rough road that led back to civilization, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the endless trees behind me. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something important. There had been no sign of the tracks I'd followed, no evidence that anyone had been out there at all. The shelter in the clearing had vanished, as if it had never been there. The whole thing didn't make sense, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not until I figured out what had really happened in those woods. Something out there had been watching me, and it wasn't human. It started when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at my cabin in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place I'd fixed up over the years. A one-room layout with a little kitchen in the corner, a wood stove, a bed, and a small table. The nearest town was a good 30-minute drive away, and the dirt road leading up to the cabin was narrow, uneven, and often covered in fallen branches or leaves, especially in the fall. I liked it that way. I liked how isolated it felt. No one dropped by unexpectedly, and the silence out there was something I couldn't get back home. I'd built most of it myself, using salvaged wood and parts from an old barn that was falling apart on a friend's property. Over the years, I'd added small touches: heavy blackout curtains, a proper lock on the door, a new propane stove when the old one rusted out. There was no cell service out there. I had an old radio, but I rarely turned it on. I brought books, food, and tools, and that was usually enough for me. The nights got cold, especially this late in the year, but I always brought plenty of firewood and blankets. I enjoyed the stillness. No cars, no buzzing from the city, just wind, trees, and sometimes the quiet creak of the old beams in the roof. I arrived in the late afternoon on a Thursday. I parked my truck just off the clearing and made a few trips carrying supplies: canned food, water jugs, some tools, a new axe I'd picked up, and a few odds and ends I thought I might use for repairs. Everything seemed fine at first. The door creaked open like it always did, and the inside smelled the way I remembered, like dry wood and a faint trace of pine smoke. I unpacked slowly, setting everything where I liked it. I made sure the windows were latched tight, pulled the curtains, and stacked firewood beside the stove. The chill in the air meant I'd need a fire that night, but for now, I just sat outside on the small porch and watched the last bit of daylight fade between the trees. It got dark fast, faster than I expected. I started a fire and made a simple meal: beans, some jerky, and a boiled egg I'd brought in a cooler. The radio picked up a weak AM station that faded in and out, just enough to give the cabin some background noise. I was asleep not long after that, buried under 2 heavy blankets, the fire cracking softly. The first night passed without anything strange happening. I woke up around dawn, cold but well-rested. I added more wood to the stove and made some instant coffee. Outside, the frost on the grass sparkled in the sunlight. I decided to go for a walk, something I always did the second day. The woods behind the cabin weren't very dense, and I had a couple of rough trails I'd made over the years. I walked for a few hours, just clearing my head, occasionally stopping to admire the way the sunlight cut through the branches. I didn't see anyone. I never did. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. It was nothing obvious, nothing out of place. The door was still locked. The windows were shut. My gear was right where I left it, but there was this strange feeling in my stomach, like something had shifted. I told myself it was just nerves. Maybe I'd been too relaxed, and my mind was playing tricks. I kept busy, chopping wood, repairing a loose shingle on the roof, sweeping out pine needles that had blown in through the cracks. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it groaning through the trees, and sometimes I thought I heard it scrape across the roof like branches or something else dragging across the shingles. I kept the fire going. I read for a while by lantern light, then eventually turned in, pulling the blankets high. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. No reason, no noise that I could remember, just this awful sense that I wasn't alone. I sat up and listened. The fire had burned low. The cabin was cold, but there was no sound, no wind, no animals, nothing. I got up and checked the door, still locked. I peeked out the window, but it was pitch black outside, too dark to see anything. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, just a few of them, on the far side of the clearing near the tree line. Too big for a deer. The pattern was off. Not hooves, not boots either, not clearly, but it looked like someone had walked through while the ground was still soft from the night frost. I crouched down and looked closer. 5 toes, human, barefoot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. I thought about animals, bears maybe, but I'd seen plenty of bear tracks before, and these weren't that. These were human. I tried to convince myself maybe they were old. Maybe someone had wandered through days ago, but they were fresh. The edges were still crisp. I could see where the grass had been bent, not yet springing back. I checked the rest of the clearing. Nothing else. No prints near the cabin. Just those few along the edge, almost like someone had come just close enough to watch. I spent the rest of the day unsettled. I didn't go on another walk. I stayed close, keeping my knife on my belt, my axe nearby. I didn't have a gun. I usually didn't need one. The cabin felt smaller now, less safe. I kept looking out the window, thinking I'd see someone at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. That night I didn't sleep much at all. Every time I dozed off, I'd jerk awake at the slightest creak. I kept the fire going brighter than usual. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping on frost-covered leaves. I froze and listened. Nothing else. I didn't get up. I didn't check. I just lay there, eyes wide, heart pounding, clutching the knife under the covers. The next morning, I stepped outside with the axe in hand. There were more footprints, this time closer to the cabin. One came within 10 feet of the porch. I followed them, heart pounding, down the side of the clearing, but they vanished at the tree-line again. Just like before, they looked barefoot. No drag marks, no signs of an animal. That's when I noticed something else. Near the side of the cabin, under the window, there were scratch marks. Thin lines across the wooden siding, maybe a foot long each, like someone had dragged fingers or maybe something sharp across the boards. I hadn't seen them before. They weren't there when I arrived. The wood was fresh, pale against the older, weather-worn siding. I don't know how long I stood there. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and leave, but I didn't. I told myself it was probably just a prank. Maybe some local kids messing around. But who the hell walks barefoot through the woods in late fall? I stayed inside the rest of the day. I kept the door locked, curtains drawn. I didn't cook. I didn't read. I just sat at the table with the axe and waited. That night, I left the lantern burning. I kept the fire high, and still I couldn't sleep. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept imagining someone standing just outside the door, listening, waiting. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, right outside the window, just the slow, steady inhale and exhale. I didn't look. I just stayed still, trying not to breathe too loud myself. By morning, it was gone. No footprints this time, but the scratch marks had gotten deeper. A second set now, just beside the first. I walked the perimeter, looking for signs of anyone, but it was the same story. No trails, no boot prints, nothing but those same human-shaped barefoot marks near the trees. They never led far, just in and out like someone stepping into the clearing, standing still, and then backing away. I made the decision to leave that day. I packed everything, fast. The truck started up slow. It always struggled in the cold, but I didn't waste time. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I got in and drove straight to town. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That someone had been watching my cabin? That I found footprints and scratch marks but never saw a face? It all sounded paranoid, ridiculous, but it didn't feel that way out there. Felt real, too real. A week later, I went back, but I didn't go alone. I brought a friend with me, someone who knew the woods, who didn't scare easy. We stayed one night just to see. Nothing happened. The prints were gone. The scratch marks still there, but weathered now, faded by wind and time. We checked the area, but there was nothing else to find. Eventually, I went back to staying there alone again, but it was never the same. I never shook the feeling that someone had been watching me. I started bringing a gun just in case. I reinforced the door, put bars on the windows. It made me feel better, but not safe. Not really. It's been over a year since it happened, and I've gone back several times since. Nothing strange has happened again. No more footprints, no more scratches. But I still find myself waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, listening for breathing outside the window. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm standing on the porch at dusk, I look out toward the tree line and feel that same weight in my gut. that heavy, crawling awareness that someone might be watching from just beyond the trees, barefoot, silent, waiting. It had been a long time since I went up to the cabin alone. The last few years, I always brought someone with me, either a cousin or a buddy from work, just to make the days pass easier. But this time I wanted to get away from everything, clear my head, and feel that kind of peace you only get when there's no service, no noise, no one to deal with. Just the wind, trees, maybe some deer if I got lucky. I figured a long weekend at the hunting cabin would do me good. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a one-room shack about 30 miles past the last stretch of pavement, tucked away behind a maze of logging roads that barely looked like roads anymore. Most people would have passed it a dozen times and never known it was there. My dad built it with his brothers in the 80s, all by hand, and over the years it became the place we all went when we needed to disappear for a while. It wasn't much, just wood walls, a tin roof, an old wood stove, and a couple bunks. But it was solid, dry, and isolated. Exactly what I wanted. I took my old truck up the trailhead Friday morning. The weather was colder than usual for that time of year. Late October, with a gray sky that looked like it wanted to snow. I had packed the truck the night before with everything I'd need. Food, water, ammo, my rifle, sleeping bag, firewood, and a few old lanterns. Most of the time when I go out there, I prepare like I might not see anyone for days. And I didn't expect to. By the time I made it up the last hill, the truck wheels slipping in the soft dirt, it was mid-afternoon. I parked in the clearing about 50 feet from the cabin, right near the old fire ring. The forest was silent in that way that makes your ears ring if you stand still too long. That quiet can feel peaceful, but sometimes it feels off, like the woods are holding their breath. I hauled everything inside, stacked the firewood by the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the lower bunk, and cracked open one of the cans of chili I brought. There was no running water or power, just the basics. I ate quick, set a few things in place for the morning hunt, and then stepped outside to walk the perimeter like I always did the first day. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and I saw fresh deer tracks maybe 20 yards out behind the cabin, just by the stand of birch trees. That was a good sign. I also saw what looked like older boot prints, deep in the mud, heading off toward the east ridge. They didn't look like mine, and they weren't my size, wider feet, heavier step. I told myself it could have been an old print from a few weeks ago, maybe even one of my cousins, but I hadn't heard of anyone coming up here since last season. I didn't think too much about it. I went back inside, lit the lanterns, started a fire in the stove, and settled in for the night. The warmth filled the cabin slow, and I sat by the stove reading from a beat-up paperback I kept in my pack. The kind of book you read 5 times but always take anyway. The first night passed quiet, though I didn't sleep great. I kept waking up to little noises, sticks cracking, leaves shifting outside. Could have been squirrels or a raccoon poking around. I kept the rifle within reach anyway, just in case. In the morning, I was up before dawn. Made coffee with the old percolator, got dressed, and headed out to the blind I built about 100 yards behind the cabin. It was colder than the day before, and fog hung low in the trees, making it hard to see more than 50 feet in any direction. Everything was still. I sat in that blind for hours, barely moving. Around 9 a.m., I heard something big moving through the brush to my left. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow but heavy. I raised the rifle and waited, but the shape that moved into the clearing wasn't a deer. It was a man. He was maybe 50 yards away, coming through the trees like he belonged there, but I'd never seen him before in my life. He wasn't dressed like a hunter. No orange, no camo, just a dark coat and jeans, tall, bearded, walking slow. He didn't have a rifle or a bow. No gear, just walking. I stayed still and watched him. He didn't look my way. He just walked across the ridge and disappeared back into the trees. I sat there another hour before I moved. The air felt colder after that. I walked back to the cabin with the rifle slung but ready, checking behind me more than once. Once I was inside, I locked the door and stood by the stove, thinking. The cabin wasn't on any public land. It was surrounded by private timber plots, and the only way in was the logging road I drove up. Seeing someone out there without gear, without orange, just wandering, it didn't feel right. That afternoon, I didn't go back out. I stayed around the cabin, kept the fire going, cleaned my rifle again, made sure everything was in place. I even dragged a big log in front of the door from the inside, just for extra security. I felt a little stupid doing it, but I didn't care. Something in me said to be ready. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I made dinner, listened to the wind pick up, and tried not to think too much about that guy. Just before bed, I went outside to relieve myself and scan the tree-line. That's when I noticed something strange. There were boot prints again, fresh, leading up near the side of the cabin, maybe 10 feet from the wall. My heart started racing. I hadn't left the cabin since midday. No one had any reason to come this close. I followed the prints with a flashlight. They came from the trees, looped around near the window, then backtracked into the woods. I didn't hear anyone approach, didn't hear anyone leave. I went back inside fast and locked the door behind me. I killed the lanterns and sat in the dark by the stove, rifle across my lap. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat up, listening to every noise. Around 2 a.m., I heard something on the porch. Wood creaking just once. Not an animal, not wind, something stepping on the boards. I held my breath, waited, rifle aimed at the door. Nothing happened after that. No knock, no more noise. By dawn, I was still sitting there, wide awake, heart beating hard. I didn't go hunting that morning. I waited for daylight, then went outside to check. More boot prints on the porch this time. Same pattern. Come up from the woods, stop at the window, back away. This wasn't some lost hiker. This was someone who knew where the cabin was. Someone watching. I packed up, fast. I didn't even finish breakfast. I grabbed everything I could, loaded the truck, and took one last look around the clearing. My hands were shaking as I locked the cabin door behind me. I drove back down the logging road, slow, careful, eyes scanning every turn. About 2 miles from the highway, just before the road straightened out, I saw fresh tire tracks crossing mine. Not from my truck. Different tread pattern, wider. Someone else had come through. Maybe while I was still up there. Maybe parked further down and walked up. When I made it back to town, I stopped at the diner and sat in the back booth, just trying to settle down. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Didn't want the questions. Didn't want to explain why a grown man couldn't handle a solo weekend in a cabin he'd been going to for years. But something changed after that. I didn't go back that season, or the next. I didn't feel like hunting. Didn't even clean my gear. Months later, I finally went up again, but not alone. My cousin came with me. We checked everything. The cabin was untouched. No signs of break-in. No new tracks. But deep in the woods, behind the birch stand, we found something. A campsite. Old, but recent enough to know it had been used in the last year. Tarp strung between trees. Fire pit made from river rock. Scraps of packaging. A can of beans still half full and rusting. And footprints. The same kind. Wide, deep. Someone had been living back there. Watching. I never found out who or why. After that, I added a lock to the inside of the cabin door. Replaced the old window with one that doesn't open. I don't go alone anymore, and I don't sleep easy up there like I used to. That place still feels like home, but something about it changed after that weekend. It's not the ghosts you should be afraid of. It's the people who hide in the quiet. Now when I hear a twig snap outside at night, I don't brush it off. I check, every time, because once someone watches you from the dark, from close enough to touch the window without you knowing, you don't forget that feeling, and you don't want to feel it again. It was a cold winter night when I found myself at the cabin. It wasn't exactly a remote cabin, but it was far enough out of town to feel isolated. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend there, escaping from our busy lives. It was meant to be a fun, relaxing time, fireplace, good food, maybe a few drinks, and lots of stories. I didn't know that night would turn into something far more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. The cabin was small, made of old wood with a rustic charm. The inside smelled faintly of pine and the wood-burning stove, a pleasant scent that helped me relax. My friends had already started a fire when I arrived, and we spent the evening sitting around it, chatting and drinking. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle every now and then, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. It was winter, after all. We all went to bed fairly early, exhausted from the long drive. I ended up in a small room at the back of the cabin, a simple bed with a heavy quilt, and a window that faced the woods behind the house. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up later in the night. Something had disturbed me. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but I felt an odd sense of unease. It was the kind of feeling that crawls under your skin and sticks there. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal outside. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I could hear the soft crackling of the fire from the main room, but other than that, there was nothing. No creaking of the old building settling, no sounds from the woods. I glanced out the window, hoping to see the reassuring sight of snow falling softly outside, but instead, I saw nothing but darkness. The moonlight didn't reach far enough through the trees to give any detail. I tried to roll over and go back to sleep, but something made me sit up in bed. A sudden, sharp noise came from the woods, a twig snapping. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal makes when it's moving through the forest. It was more deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the snow. I held my breath, listening. The sound was faint at first, but then it came again, closer this time. My heart started to beat faster, my body frozen with the awareness that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I get up and check, or stay where I was and pretend I hadn't heard it? I didn't want to make a sound, not in case whatever was out there heard me. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Could it be another person? Someone else in the woods, maybe a hiker or someone lost. But I knew that was ridiculous. The nearest road was miles away. No one would be out here in the middle of the night. Then the sound came again. This time it was unmistakable. A scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. It wasn't a branch or a twig. It was something much heavier, something deliberate. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that the sound was so close or that it seemed to be coming directly from the woods just outside the cabin. I slipped out of bed and moved quietly to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything, just shadows in the trees. For a few moments, I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me, or some animal that had wandered too close. But then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was moving. There was something in the trees, a figure standing unnaturally still. It wasn't a person. It didn't look human. The shape was all wrong. Its posture was too rigid, like it wasn't supposed to stand that way. I couldn't make out many details, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. Its silhouette seemed too thin, too tall, and its limbs bent in odd angles. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. Was it an animal? But no animal I knew stood like that. Was it a person? But I couldn't imagine any human being out there. Not at this hour, not in that position. I was paralyzed, unable to move, my eyes fixed on the figure in the dark. Then, as if it had sensed my gaze, it shifted. It wasn't a fast movement, but it was enough to send a wave of cold terror through me. The figure didn't turn its head, but its body twisted slightly, as though it was aware that I was watching. And then, the worst part, it looked toward me. The moonlight was too weak to reveal its face, but I could feel its gaze. It was as if it could see me even from this distance. It stood there, unmoving, just staring. The air in the room felt thicker, as though it was pressing down on me. I felt suffocated, trapped in this terrible, unblinking moment. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I didn't know if it was fear or if I was simply frozen by the impossibility of what I was seeing. I don't know how long I stayed there watching that thing in the woods, but eventually, it moved again. This time, it wasn't a shift of the body, it was a full, slow step forward. I could hear the snow crunch under its weight, and for a split second, I thought it was coming toward the cabin. I quickly backed away from the window, stumbling in my panic. My mind was in a frenzy. Should I wake the others? What was I supposed to do? I didn't even know what I was dealing with. I crept back to my bed and tried to calm my breathing. The only thing I could think of was to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I pulled the covers over my head, as if that would somehow protect me. Minutes turned into hours, or at least it felt like it. Couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed amplified. The wind howling outside, the soft rustling of the trees. Every crack in the walls seemed louder than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about the thing I had seen. Was it still out there? Was it watching me? Eventually, exhaustion won over my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, my dreams filled with twisted images of the creature from the woods. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun had risen, casting a pale light through the window. I was still in the same position, tangled in my blankets, and the cabin was eerily quiet. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, my body sore from the tension of the night. I didn't want to look outside, but I knew I had to. Hesitantly, I stood up and moved to the window again. The woods were still, peaceful even. There was no sign of anything unusual. No figure lurking in the trees, no shadowy shape moving between them. It was as though nothing had happened, as if everything I had seen was a figment of my imagination. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I stepped outside later that morning, I noticed something. There were deep, irregular tracks in the snow leading up to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, not like any animal I knew. They were wide, jagged, almost like they were made by something with too many limbs or an uneven gait. They circled the cabin, as though whatever it was had been pacing around it all night. I followed the tracks a little ways, but when I came to the edge of the woods, I stopped. There, in the snow, were more tracks, leading deeper into the trees. I never stayed at that cabin again. I never told anyone about what I had seen that night. Maybe they would have thought I was crazy, or worse, maybe they would have believed me, and that thought terrified me more than anything. Sometimes, when I pass by the area where the cabin used to be, I can't help but wonder what it was I saw that night. I'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain. I'll never forget that feeling. That cold, crawling fear that something was out there, something that shouldn't have been. I was alone in the cabin, trying to enjoy the last bit of the weekend before heading back to work on Monday. My friends had left that morning after a few days of hiking and fishing. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, tucked in a little valley where no one really came unless they were staying at the cabin. It was the perfect getaway for me. Quiet, isolated, no one around for miles. It wasn't the first time I'd come up here, but something felt off this time. I had settled into the usual routine, getting a fire going in the hearth, heating up some leftover food, and sitting down to watch the fire flicker, its warmth a nice contrast to the cool evening air outside. The windows were closed, but you could still hear the wind rustling the trees, making the forest feel alive, like it was watching, listening. I didn't think much of it, though. I was used to the woods by now. I grew up camping and hiking, and the sounds of nature never bothered me. That night, though, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I shrugged it off as paranoia, the kind that creeps up when you're out in the middle of nowhere with no one around but trees and animals. I wasn't scared, not exactly, just uneasy. I was sitting in front of the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound filling the cabin, when I heard it. A noise from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger like a bear moving through the underbrush. But then the sound came again. A heavy, deliberate step, too loud and heavy to be anything normal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a bear or a large dog, something common that I had encountered before. But the steps didn't stop. They were getting closer, slow, measured steps, like something was stalking its way toward the cabin. The fire crackled again, but the noise outside seemed to drown it out. I stood up and moved to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass to try and see what was out there. All I could see was darkness, the kind of pitch-black dark that the forest brings once the sun's gone. I squinted, trying to focus on the shadows that moved just outside the cabin, but nothing stood out. My mind was racing, and the unease was growing into something deeper now, a cold, sick feeling settling in my gut. My first thought was to grab my phone, but I knew there was no signal out here. The cabin was off the grid, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing. I was completely cut off. I went over to the door and peered out through the small gap where the door didn't quite meet the frame. The cold night air slipped in, making me shiver. The forest was still, except for that noise, slow, deliberate steps. It was like whatever it was knew I was in here, and it was getting closer. I pulled the door open just a crack, enough to slip outside, but I didn't want to expose myself completely. I stepped onto the porch, my breath clouding in front of me, and I crouched low, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My eyes were darting in every direction, trying to find whatever was making that sound. The night seemed too still, too quiet. Everything felt wrong. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. The wind rustled the trees again, and my heartbeat was louder in my ears than anything around me. I waited, straining my ears, hoping to hear anything that would let me know what was going on. And then I heard it, a low growl, deep and rumbling, coming from the trees. It wasn't the growl of a bear or any animal I recognized. It was too deep, too unsettling. I froze. My brain screamed at me to go back inside, lock the door, and forget this ever happened, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the trees where the sound was coming from. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was large, much larger than any person or animal I'd ever seen. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't. Its body was too upright, like a man's, but covered in fur. Its arms were long, its back hunched forward, and its head was shaped wrong, too angular, too canine. The thing looked like a wolf, but with the body of a man walking on two legs. It stopped at the edge of the trees, just inside the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I could see its chest rise and fall with each breath, its muscles rippling under the fur. My heart raced as it slowly took another step toward the cabin. The growl rumbled again from deep in its chest, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I wasn't sure if it could see me, but I knew it was aware of my presence. Without thinking, I rushed back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking, and I had to steady myself before I could even think about what to do next. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and pointed it toward the door, then slowly moved to the windows again. I could still hear it outside, pacing, growling softly. I was trapped in the cabin with no way to defend myself. No weapon, no phone, no one coming to help. My only hope was that it wasn't interested in getting any closer, but I knew that wasn't likely. I felt like I was being hunted. For what felt like hours, I sat in the darkness, barely breathing, watching the trees. The creature didn't leave. It stayed just outside the cabin, moving around, but never getting too close. It was like it was waiting for something. The whole time, I kept my eyes glued to the window, my hand wrapped around the flashlight, trying to make myself as small as possible. Eventually, the sounds began to fade. The growls stopped, the footsteps too, and then silence. I don't know how long it took, but I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It was still dark outside, but the forest had quieted down. It felt like the creature had gone. It was the longest night I'd ever experienced. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, listening, waiting for any sound to let me know it was still out there. But there was nothing. When morning came, I felt a strange relief, but I didn't dare step outside right away. I waited until the sun had risen higher, and the woods were bathed in light before I opened the door. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the forest. There was no sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing made sense. The creature was unlike anything I had ever heard of before. It was a wolf-like thing, but so much bigger and so much more menacing. A part of me wondered if I had imagined it, but the deep, primal fear I felt was real. The whole day was spent pacing around the cabin, too afraid to leave and too scared to stay. I packed up my things, making sure I had everything before I got in my car. The drive back to the city was long and uneventful, but I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. The growl, the eyes. It felt like something was watching me even as I left that place behind. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. No one would believe me anyway. Who would? It wasn't the kind of thing you just talk about. But I knew what I saw. I knew what was out there, and I wasn't ever going back to that cabin again. It wasn't worth the risk. I had gotten too close to something that shouldn't be in the woods, something that no one should ever have to face. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was real. It was out there somewhere, and it was waiting. The night I first saw the creature, I was alone in the cabin. It wasn't supposed to be a scary night, or at least it shouldn't have been. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, far from any neighbors, on a patch of land my uncle owned. I had been there plenty of times before, but that night felt different. The air was heavier, the trees seemed quieter, and the cabin itself felt like it was holding its breath. It wasn't until later that I realized the weight in the air was more than just an odd feeling. The evening had started out normal enough. I'd spent most of the day working on a few projects in the woods, clearing some of the underbrush that had started creeping in. It wasn't the hardest work, but it was isolating, and by the time I was done, I was looking forward to a quiet evening in the cabin. I got a fire going and settled into a chair by the window, watching the last bits of daylight disappear over the horizon. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't enough to make the trees sway too much, just enough to make the branches creak now and then. I had a good amount of food stocked up in the cabin, so I started heating some leftovers. There was a sense of peace in the quiet of the cabin, like the world outside had faded into nothing. But as the night wore on, that peace turned into a strange sense of unease. I don't know if it was the way the wind sounded, or maybe it was the way the shadows outside the window seemed to stretch just a little too far. But something felt off. It felt like I was being watched, though I kept telling myself that was impossible. There was nothing out there but trees and rocks. After finishing my meal, I sat back down by the fire. The flames were low now, just glowing embers, casting long shadows against the cabin walls. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A rustling, like something was moving through the woods just outside the cabin. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound felt different. It wasn't the usual shuffle of small creatures. This was deliberate, purposeful. It sounded like something larger, something more intentional. I stood up, walking quietly to the window. I didn't want to make any noise and draw attention to myself. Outside, the world was dark, too dark for anything to be clearly visible, but there was a shift in the shadows. I couldn't see anything at first, but my eyes kept darting around, looking for movement. The rustling continued, closer now, almost as if it was right outside the cabin walls. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds. There were soft thuds, like something heavy was moving across the ground, and then the unmistakable snap of a twig breaking. I moved back from the window, heart pounding. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it an animal? A bear? No, it wasn't moving like an animal. Bears shuffle, move in slow, heavy patterns. This was more deliberate, controlled, and it was getting closer. I wasn't sure why, but I felt the need to check the door. I didn't want to believe something was out there, but the more I listened, the more it seemed impossible to ignore. I double-checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but none came. I decided to wait it out. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe there was some other explanation I wasn't seeing. But the longer I sat, the more the unease settled into my bones. The rustling stopped for a moment, but I could still feel that pressure in the air, that feeling of being watched. I kept my eyes on the door, not sure whether I was hoping something would happen or hoping nothing would at all. It was when I turned back to the window that I saw it. Just beyond the trees, barely visible in the low light, there was something standing still. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't an animal, though it resembled one. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, almost spindly, but its body was stocky, bulky in a way that didn't seem natural. It wasn't the way an animal moved at all. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it. It didn't seem to notice me, or if it did, it didn't care. It continued to move, weaving through the trees with that slow, measured pace. I could barely make out its face, if it even had one. But the way it moved, how it seemed to glide between the trees, made every part of me scream to run. But I couldn't. I was frozen, too terrified to even blink. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the woods, where the trees thinned out and the clearing around the cabin began. Stood there, just staring. I didn't know how, but I felt it looking straight at me. Couldn't look away. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my heart in my chest. It stood still for what felt like an eternity. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't run, I couldn't hide. The cabin was too exposed. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing made sense. I felt like the air itself was suffocating me, pressing in on all sides. But then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the creature moved again. This time, it wasn't slow and deliberate. It moved with a quickness that seemed out of place for its size. It darted toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling as I flicked it on. I knew I couldn't go outside, not alone, not with whatever that thing was out there, but I needed to check. I had to see if it was still around. The cabin felt like a prison, but out there, whatever it was, it might still be nearby. I stepped outside, my feet crunching on the gravel, the light from the flashlight trembling in my grip. The world outside was silent, too silent. No rustling in the trees, no sound of animals moving. Just the wind and the soft creaking of the cabin behind me. I shone the light into the woods, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No creature, no movement, just the dark, empty woods. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting by the window, flashlight in hand, waiting. I didn't dare leave the cabin again. Even when the morning light started to creep in, I felt like I had to stay vigilant. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew it wasn't something normal, something that could be explained by any animal I'd ever encountered. It was something else. By the time morning came, the creature, whatever it was gone. The sun was up, the world looked normal again, but I didn't feel normal. I didn't feel safe. I spent the day checking the perimeter of the cabin, making sure nothing had been disturbed. There were no tracks, no sign that anything had come close. The woods around me looked calm, peaceful even. But I knew better now. The feeling of being watched lingered. Couldn't shake it, no matter what I did. I packed up and left that afternoon, driving back to town, my eyes constantly on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me. I still don't know what it was or why it was there, but I know it wasn't something I ever want to see again. It's been years, and I still don't go back to that cabin. I can't. Something tells me it's still out there, waiting, and I don't plan on finding out what it wants. I had always wanted a cabin. Something small, secluded, and nestled deep in the woods where I could get away from the noise of the world. When the opportunity came up, I jumped at it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I found it at the edge of a dense forest, far from any neighbors. The cabin itself was old, the kind that had character, though I couldn't say much for its upkeep. The wood was weathered and the roof had a few patches here and there, but it felt right. There was a rustic charm about it, and that was enough for me. The first time I drove up, I could barely make out the shape of the cabin through the thick pines surrounding it. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and gnarled, stretching toward the sky like they had stood there for centuries. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, the sound of crunching rocks under the tires was the only noise for miles. I parked, got out, and breathed in the fresh air. It smelled of pine and earth, cool and crisp, like nothing I had ever smelled before. For a moment, everything felt quiet and peaceful, as if the world had been left behind. The inside of the cabin was cozy. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, and the wooden beams above seemed sturdy, if a bit worn. There was a simple kitchen, a small table, and a couple of chairs. A few beds were tucked away in corners. It didn't look like much, but that was exactly the way I liked it. A place to retreat, to be alone. The first night there, the silence was almost deafening. I was used to the noise of the city, so this deep quiet was something I wasn't prepared for. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. But that was it, just the sound of nature, far removed from everything I had ever known. I made a fire, settled into an old armchair by the hearth, and let the flames crackle. It wasn't long before I felt the weight of isolation pressing in, but it didn't scare me. It was peaceful, at least for the moment. But as the evening wore on, something changed. It was subtle at first, a sound that didn't quite belong, a scraping noise, not like a branch rubbing against the roof or a small animal scurrying by. This sound was different. It was heavier, slow. It seemed to circle the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it stopped, only to start again, this time on the opposite side of the house. I sat up straighter, my gaze flicking toward the windows, but I saw nothing. The trees stood still, their shadows long in the pale moonlight. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I didn't know. Still, the scraping continued, and then came the sound of someone, walking across the porch. That's when I felt it, that creeping sensation, like I wasn't alone anymore. The wind picked up, and the fire crackled loudly in the hearth. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter, and walked to the door. I hesitated, listening, and the world outside felt too still, too quiet. Then the sound came again, someone dragging something heavy across the porch, just outside. I stepped back. I didn't know who would be out here. No one lived for miles, and the thought of someone creeping around at this hour made my skin prickle. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just a bear, or a group of kids playing pranks, but that didn't feel right. There was an unmistakable sense of danger now, something I couldn't explain. I leaned against the wall next to the door, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was still, too still. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, scanning the porch, the trees. Nothing. There was no one there, no sign of anything that would have caused the noise. I stepped outside, cautiously walking along the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold air bit at my skin, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I checked the area around the cabin, my flashlight catching on the trees and brush. No sign of anyone. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I checked the cabin again, making sure the door was locked, then went inside. I set the flashlight on the counter and turned to face the fire. That's when I heard it again. The scraping noise, but this time much closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I found myself standing motionless in the middle of the room. My hand instinctively reached for the fireplace poker, my fingers tightening around the cold metal. I had to see what it was. The beam of my flashlight danced nervously as I crept toward the back door. My breath caught in my throat, and every step I took seemed louder than the last. The scraping noise came again, dragging across the wood. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I was pretty sure I didn't want to see it. The door creaked as I slowly opened it, stepping outside into the inky darkness. The trees loomed like shadows, and for a moment, everything felt impossibly large. The air was thick, humid, and the sound of my own heartbeat was deafening. I turned the flashlight toward the source of the noise, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shape, a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, hunched over, its movements jerky, like it was trying to be stealthy but wasn't succeeding. My breath hitched in my throat as I watched it drag something heavy across the ground. Something I couldn't make out in the dark. I knew I should run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the figure. The scraping continued, and then, with a loud, grating sound, the thing turned and disappeared into the woods. The beam of my flashlight followed the path it took, but there was nothing, just trees and more trees. The woods seemed to close in around me. My body was trembling. I stepped back into the cabin and locked the door behind me. I was sure I had just seen something out there in the woods. But what? Person? An animal? I had no idea. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, the poker still in my hand, eyes darting to every noise, every movement. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep, but even then, the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I went outside and inspected the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, no sign of what had been dragging that thing across the ground. I checked the porch again, the trees, the bushes. Nothing. It was as though whatever I had seen, if I had seen it, had vanished without a trace. Days passed, and the eerie feeling lingered. I tried to focus on fixing up the cabin, cutting wood, making the place feel like home, but the quiet was unsettling. The sound of something heavy being dragged was always there in the back of my mind, replaying over and over. It made me hesitant to go outside after dark, and it made me look over my shoulder more often than I liked. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set, I heard it again. The scraping noise. This time, it was different. It wasn't just outside. It was inside the cabin, slowly dragging across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stood frozen in place. The noise stopped. Then, the sound of someone scraping the wood, getting closer. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Every part of me screamed to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as something, or someone, dragged something heavy across the room. I gripped the poker tightly, my hands slick with sweat, the darkness surrounding me, suffocating. The sound moved, inching toward me. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, trying to make sense of it. There was no way it could be real. It had to be the wind, an animal, something else, but the noise grew louder, more distinct. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited. The cabin was silent, too silent. I took a step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light swept across the room, landing on the floor. There, near the corner, was something. A pile of old boards, scraps of wood, tools scattered about. Nothing was out of place. I looked around, trying to make sense of the sound. I had been on edge for days, but it didn't make sense. It felt like someone had been here. Someone had been moving things around in the dark. And then, the thought hit me, the one that terrified me more than anything. What if I wasn't alone? What if someone had been here all along, watching, waiting? I took a deep breath, swallowed the panic clawing at my throat, and grabbed my things. There was no more ignoring it. I couldn't live with the doubt, the fear gnawing at me every time I was alone in the cabin. I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, locked the cabin, and drove back to the town I had come from. I couldn't say for sure what had happened, but something told me the woods weren't the place for me. Not anymore. I left the cabin behind, its doors locked, its windows dark, and in the silence of the woods, I left the creeping fear that had taken root in my chest. I don't know who or It took me almost 3 years to save enough money to buy my cabin. I'd looked at dozens of places online, visited a handful in person, and waited until I found one that felt right. It wasn't fancy, just a small, weathered place deep in the woods, about 40 minutes off the main road by dirt path, with no neighbors in sight. It sat on 5 acres of wooded land, with a clearing in the front, a small fire pit off to the side, and a shallow creek about 200 feet behind it. The roof had been redone the year before I bought it, and the previous owner had already installed solar panels and a rain catchment system for basic power and water. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, private, and simple. The first few weekends I spent there were peaceful. I'd drive up after work on Friday, usually arriving around sunset. The trees always seemed taller and denser as I turned off the paved road and followed the long dirt path to the cabin. There were no streetlights out there, and the last half mile was especially rough and narrow. I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the bottom of my car on rocks or ruts. The cabin itself was just one story with a small loft up top, which I used for storage. Inside, there was one bedroom, a living area with a wood stove, a little kitchenette, and a bathroom that drained into a septic tank. Everything ran off solar power or propane. There was no cell service out there, but I liked that. I brought books, food, and firewood, and I'd usually go hiking or chop wood during the day and relax at night. One weekend in early fall, I decided to take a few extra days off and stay from Thursday through Monday. The weather was getting cooler, and I wanted to prepare the place for winter. I packed my truck with food, extra propane, and tools. I also brought a few motion sensor lights I'd been meaning to install along the exterior, especially near the back door and the woodshed. When I arrived, the air was crisp and dry. Leaves had started to change colors, and the forest felt quieter than usual. No bugs buzzing around, no birds singing, just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. I unloaded my supplies, checked the solar battery levels, and spent most of the afternoon chopping and stacking firewood. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, I was sore and tired. I cooked a simple dinner and fell asleep early. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. The cabin doesn't have curtains, and I'd gotten used to the light waking me. After breakfast, I hiked the perimeter of the property to check for any damage to the fencing or fallen trees. Everything looked normal, but I noticed a few small piles of scat near the creek that hadn't been there before. Probably raccoons or maybe a fox, I figured. Nothing big. Still, I made a note of it. Later that day, I started installing the motion lights. I mounted one above the back door, another near the shed, and a third at the corner of the cabin that faced the path leading into the woods. I tested them, and they seemed to work fine, sensitive to movement but not overly jumpy. I wanted some kind of early warning if animals or strangers came around at night. That night was calm. I stayed up reading by lantern light, then went to bed around 10. At some point after midnight, I woke up to the soft click of one of the motion lights turning on outside. I could see the faint glow through the edge of the window. I stayed still and listened, expecting to hear rustling or movement, but everything was silent. I got up, pulled on a jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. The light near the woodshed was on, casting sharp shadows across the stacked firewood. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound. Eventually, the light shut off. I went back inside, thinking it had probably been a deer or some other animal passing by. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to wander close to the cabin, especially in the cooler months. Still, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often the next day, especially when I was near the edge of the woods. Saturday was colder, with clouds hanging low in the sky. I spent most of the day inside, fixing a leaky sink and organizing some of the gear I kept in the loft. That evening, I lit a fire in the wood stove and made soup. I remember feeling uneasy, not scared, exactly, but restless. Something felt off. Maybe it was just the quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring a little. I didn't hear birds or squirrels, even during the day. That was starting to get to me. Just after 11, I was brushing my teeth when the motion light by the shed clicked on again. This time, I moved quickly. I didn't turn on any interior lights and quietly stepped to the front window to look out. The light illuminated the shed and part of the yard, but again, I didn't see anything moving. I stood there for a long minute, waiting. Then I saw it. Something moved behind the pile of split logs. Just a shift of shadow at first, but then a shape. Someone crouched low, half hidden by the woodpile. They were still, too still. I didn't see a face or any features, just the outline of a human figure, staying perfectly still like they thought I couldn't see them. My first thought was that it might be a hunter who got lost or some idiot playing a prank. But I hadn't heard a vehicle, and nobody had any reason to be out this far without making noise. My truck was the only way in or out unless you wanted to hike miles through rough terrain. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and remembered there was no signal. I had a satellite emergency beacon stored in the loft, but it only worked for distress calls, and I didn't know if this counted yet. I considered yelling, but something about the way that figure crouched behind the woodpile made me feel like I shouldn't let them know I'd seen them. I turned off all the lanterns and stayed low. I had a hunting rifle in the bedroom closet. It wasn't loaded, but the ammo was in a locked box under the bed. I crawled into the bedroom and started loading it with shaking hands. Every sound I made seemed deafening. I forced myself to breathe slow. I stayed in the dark for what felt like an hour, rifle in my lap, staring out the bedroom window. The motion light shut off eventually, plunging the yard back into darkness. I couldn't see the figure anymore. I didn't know if they were still there or if they'd moved. Eventually, I heard something faint, leaves crunching soft and slow, then nothing again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept thinking about that still figure, the way they crouched like they knew how to avoid being seen. By morning, the unease had turned into something harder. Anger, maybe, or stubbornness. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside, rifle slung over my shoulder. I walked to the woodpile. No one was there, but I could see where someone had stepped. Scuff marks in the dirt, a few small indentations in the dry ground. They'd been right where I saw them. Not an animal, person. I checked the shed. Nothing missing or moved. I walked the edge of the clearing but didn't see any tracks leading in or out. The ground was hard and dry, and whatever prints had been there were mostly gone. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't feel safe either. I kept my rifle close and I kept checking the tree line, the path, the windows. By that night, I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights off, watching, listening. The motion light didn't come on that night. I thought maybe whoever it was had seen the gun and left. Maybe they'd been looking to rob the place and backed off when they realized someone was here. That made the most sense. Still, the image of that crouched figure stuck in my mind. Monday morning, I packed my things and left early. As I drove down the dirt path, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step into the road behind me. Back in town, I bought more outdoor lights, game cameras, and some stronger locks for the cabin. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I did return, everything looked the same. No signs of break-in, no new tracks, no unusual movement on the cameras. I spent the whole weekend there without incident, but I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been that weekend. No birds, no squirrels, no wind, just that awful stillness. And that one figure crouched, waiting. I started going up less after that. Once a month, maybe, and never alone. I brought friends or sometimes my brother. Nothing weird happened again, but I never shook the feeling that someone had been out there, watching, waiting for something. Eventually, I sold the place. I told myself I just didn't have time to go up there anymore. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about that motion light and that shape behind the logs. I couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd gone outside that night, or if I hadn't installed those lights at all. The cabin sits empty now. I've looked it up online a few times since I sold it, just out of curiosity. The listing photos still show the woodshed, the clearing, the little porch. I wonder if the new owners ever had the same thing happen. If they ever saw the motion light flick on in the dead of night and looked out, expecting nothing, only to see someone crouched just outside the edge of the light. Maybe it was a fluke, just a stranger passing through. But I don't think so. Not with how quiet the forest was. Not with the way they didn't run. They were waiting, watching, and I still think about them. Every time I'm somewhere quiet. Every time I've spent a lot of time at my hunting cabin over the years. It's a simple place, nothing fancy. The cabin sits on the edge of a thick forest, about 10 miles from the nearest town. It's a small structure, just big enough to hold a couple of beds, a wood stove, and a table. There's a porch that wraps around 2 sides of the cabin, and behind it, the woods stretch on for miles. I've always found peace in that solitude. The quiet, the smell of pine trees, the sound of a distant stream or a bird call. It was always just me, the woods, and my rifle when I came up here to hunt. I come up here every year, usually for a week or so in early fall. The weather would start cooling down, the leaves turning, and it was the perfect time to hunt for deer or whatever else I could find. The only real concern I had during those trips was the wildlife, like the occasional bear or the packs of coyotes that would roam the woods, but that never really bothered me. I was used to the woods by then, but things started to feel different that one particular trip. It had been a long year, and I was looking forward to getting out of town. The city was starting to feel too crowded, too noisy. So, I packed up my truck, grabbed a few supplies, and headed up the familiar road that led to the cabin. It was late afternoon by the time I arrived. The sun was already dipping low, casting a golden glow across the landscape as I parked in front of the cabin. I unloaded my gear and carried everything inside. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stove. It wasn't cold enough to need heat yet, but the fire added some comfort. A crackling fire always made the place feel more like home. I was alone as usual. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think. The only company I had up there were the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, a bird call, the wind. The day passed quickly, and soon it was dark. I ate a simple dinner and sat on the couch, letting the fire warm me as I watched the flickering flames. The cabin was dark except for the orange glow from the fire. It was quiet, too quiet, in fact. Around midnight, I decided to step outside. I didn't want to go to bed yet. The night air was crisp, and the stars were bright above. I stepped onto the porch and lit a cigarette, staring into the distance. The woods beyond the cabin were a wall of darkness, the trees barely visible against the starry sky. There wasn't a sound, no animals, no wind. It felt like everything was holding its breath. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that it's never this quiet. There's always something, whether it's a night bird, the wind rustling leaves, or the distant howl of a coyote. But that night, nothing stirred. I stood there for a while, just watching the forest. My eyes kept flicking to the tree line, as if expecting something to move. But nothing did. I decided to go inside and get some sleep. But as I was about to turn around and head back into the cabin, I heard it, a faint rustle from the woods. A branch cracking like something heavy had just stepped on it. I froze. The sound was so soft, I wasn't sure I had even heard it at first. But then it came again, louder this time. I wasn't imagining it. Something was definitely out there. My heart started to race. I knew it could be anything, a deer, maybe, or a bear. But the fact that it was so quiet, so still just a minute ago, made me uneasy. I scanned the woods again, my eyes searching the darkness, trying to make sense of the sound. I didn't see anything, but that didn't mean there was nothing there. I stepped inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. The quiet inside was deafening. I tried to shake it off, but a strange feeling lingered in my gut. Felt wrong, like something was watching me. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't like it. I tried to push it out of my mind as I settled into bed. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin felt colder now. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening. I could hear the wind outside, but it wasn't the wind that was keeping me awake. It was the feeling of being watched. Couldn't shake it. I kept hearing little noises, small creaks, like someone was walking around outside. But every time I would strain my ears, there would be nothing. Hours passed, and finally exhaustion took over. I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to an odd feeling. It wasn't a specific sound or sight. It was just a feeling. Something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, pushing myself out of bed and starting the stove for some warmth. I grabbed my rifle, checked my gear, and decided I'd head out to hunt for the day. Maybe the fresh air would clear my head. I headed into the woods, making my way down the trail that led to the stream. The forest was still, but the silence was different now. It wasn't oppressive like the night before. It was the usual quiet of the woods during the day, natural, peaceful. I pushed the unease to the back of my mind and focused on the hunt. I walked for hours, scanning the trees, watching for movement, but I didn't see anything. Not a single deer, not even a bird. It was like the forest had emptied out, leaving only me behind. By late afternoon, I headed back to the cabin, still feeling on edge. I'd seen no signs of life, no tracks, no animals. It was too quiet. Again, when I got back to the cabin, I noticed something, a small, subtle change. The woodpile out front was disturbed. The logs that had been neatly stacked were now scattered around the base, as if someone or something had knocked them over. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I hadn't done that. I hadn't touched the woodpile since the last time I was up here. My mind raced as I looked around. Had someone been here? No. I knew I was the only one on the property. No one else knew about the cabin. I always made sure to keep it that way, but the thought lingered. Someone could have been here. I spent the rest of the evening in the cabin, checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. But the feeling wouldn't leave me, the sense that something was wrong. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind outside, made my heart jump. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed up my things and decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for me. I had been coming to that cabin for years, and I had never felt like this before. It was as if the woods themselves were closing in on me. I made my way to the truck, but as I started to drive down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin, now small in the distance, seemed so isolated, alone. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been watching me, and it was still out there. The road was long and winding, and the further I got, the more the tension in my chest eased. The woods receded behind me, and with each passing mile, I felt a little bit lighter. By the time I reached the main highway, the weight of it all finally lifted. But I never went back to that cabin. Something about that trip, something about that feeling has stayed with me. There was nothing supernatural, no monsters, no ghosts. It was just a strange unease that I couldn't explain. But it was enough to make me walk away from something that had always been a part of me. I don't know what I felt that night or why it changed everything, but I do know that sometimes even the most familiar places can turn strange in ways you can't understand. And I guess that's the scariest part of all. The feeling that sometimes the woods aren't as empty as they seem. I had always thought of the cabin as a retreat, a quiet getaway from the everyday noise of the world. It was a small place, tucked away in the woods, with a couple of acres of land around it. Just me, the trees, and a creek that ran through the back. No neighbors for miles and no phones. Peace. I had been going there for years, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, just to escape. The place had always been reliable, safe even. But that changed when I noticed the creature. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. I was out walking one evening, as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, when I saw something move in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. There were plenty of wildlife in the area, deer, squirrels, foxes, but this thing moved differently. It was too low to the ground and it had an odd shape. I froze, my heart picking up speed as I tried to make out what it was. It was like a dog, but not quite. It was too big for a dog with a lean, almost sickly body. Its fur was matted and uneven, with patches of it falling out, revealing dark, scabby skin underneath. It had a long tail, but it wasn't wagging like any dog's would. It was curled up, almost like it was protecting something. The thing didn't seem aggressive at first. In fact, it didn't seem like it wanted to be noticed at all. It just stared at me with its wide, too bright eyes, its head slightly tilted, like it was trying to figure me out. I stood still, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to leave, but something about the creature held me there. I slowly stepped back, careful not to make any sudden movements, and watched it disappear into the thick undergrowth. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was nothing. A wild animal, just a strange one. Maybe a coyote or something else I hadn't seen before. That night, I tried to forget about it. The cabin was still the same as always, quiet, peaceful. I made myself dinner, then settled in with a book and a glass of wine. The creaking of the wood and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees was familiar. The kind of sounds that made you feel safe, like everything was in its place. But as the night wore on, I began to hear something else. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it started to creep in like a whisper. There was scratching at the door. Not frantic, but methodical. Just enough to make me put down my book and listen. I sat there, tense, trying to convince myself it was just a branch brushing against the door, maybe an animal passing by. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder. The scratching was accompanied by a low growl, the kind you would expect from a dog, but deeper, more unsettling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stood from the couch slowly. I grabbed the flashlight by the door and moved cautiously toward it. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the wood of the porch, but there was nothing there. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, the trees around me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I saw nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I wasn't used to being out here alone, that's all. But as I made my way back to the door, I glanced down at the ground. That's when I saw it. A trail of paw prints, large and deep, leading from the woods to my front door. They were too big for a dog, and they weren't like any tracks I had seen before. The pads were too wide and the claws too sharp. My breath caught in my throat as I realized just how much I had missed earlier. This wasn't a normal animal. Whatever it was bigger and it was out there. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next day, I packed up my things and made sure the cabin was locked up tight before heading out for a walk again. This time, I was more cautious. I kept my eyes peeled, alert to every sound around me. The woods felt different now, darker somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The creature showed up again the next night. I was sitting on the porch, staring out at the creek, when I saw it. It was moving through the trees, not far from the cabin. Its eyes glinted in the moonlight, and I froze, unsure of whether to move or stay hidden. It was the same creature, but it looked different this time. More gaunt, more desperate. It was walking on all fours, but its gait was uneven, almost dragging. Its fur was more patchy now, like it hadn't eaten in days. I didn't know if it was sick or starving, but it didn't look healthy. I watched as it crept closer, moving with a quiet determination. It didn't seem to notice me yet, but it was getting closer with every step. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what it was or why it was out there, but I didn't want to find out. I stayed inside the rest of the night, my nerves frayed. I didn't dare go outside again. The creature didn't leave, though. I could hear it circling the cabin, its low growls mixing with the sounds of the wind. Sometimes, I could hear it scratching at the door, just like before. Other times, it would growl low and deep, like it was trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. That night, I slept fitfully. The sound of the creature's breathing, its pacing, kept me awake. I couldn't tell how long it had been out there, but it felt like an eternity. By morning, it was gone. The scratching had stopped, and when I cautiously opened the door, I saw nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature. It was like it had never been there at all. But I knew it had been. I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. I spent most of my time inside the cabin, trying to ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. I couldn't go back to sleep, and I couldn't stop checking the door and windows every few minutes. The creature hadn't come back, but I knew it was still out there. I could feel it lurking in the shadows. Then, one afternoon, I went out to the woods again, trying to clear my head. I had to know what this thing was, what it wanted. The air was thick with humidity, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The sounds of the forest were louder now, more urgent, like the earth was holding its breath. I walked for what felt like hours, until I finally found it. The creature. It was crouched in a clearing, its head low, watching something. Couldn't tell what. It was emaciated now, its bones jutting out from under the skin. The matted fur clung to its body like it had been soaked in mud. Its eyes glowed faintly in the shade, locked onto whatever it had been stalking. I stayed still, not wanting to make a sound. I had to know what it was doing. The creature didn't move. It stayed frozen, its tail twitching slightly, as if it was waiting for something. And then it happened. A noise broke the stillness. A rustle, something moving in the underbrush. The creature's head snapped up, its ears perked. It was gone in a flash, darting into the trees with a speed I hadn't expected. I stood there, my heart pounding, as I watched it disappear into the forest. The next day, I packed up everything and left the cabin behind. I didn't want to stay there anymore. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't safe. It wasn't right. The woods felt oppressive now, like they were hiding something I wasn't meant to understand. I don't know what happened to that creature. Maybe it's still out there, wandering the woods. Maybe it found a new home, or maybe it just vanished. But I'll never forget it. The way it watched me, the way it moved. And I'll never go back to that cabin, not as long as I live. It was the middle of October, and I had decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin up in the woods. I was in desperate need of a break, and this cabin was perfect. It was remote, tucked away in the dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. The air was crisp, the leaves had started to turn, and the whole area had that quiet, serene vibe you get only when you're far from civilization. I had rented the cabin for a couple of days through an online site. The owner had promised it was peaceful, secluded, and had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a fireplace, a bed, and a porch that looked out over a small clearing. I was ready for some time to myself. The kind of quiet where you don't hear anything except the wind and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the trees. When I got to the cabin, everything seemed fine. The place was exactly as advertised. Rustic, charming, and full of character. The wooden walls creaked with the house's age, but that just added to the charm. There was a little firewood stacked by the door, and the stove was all set up for use. The first thing I did was settle in, make some tea, and then sit on the porch. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The temperature dropped as soon as the sun disappeared behind the hills. I spent the first few hours just enjoying the solitude. I read, watched the sunset, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The occasional bird call or rustle in the leaves was the only thing that broke the stillness. As night fell, I made myself some dinner, nothing fancy, just a simple meal of pasta and some bread. I was trying to stick to a routine to make the most of my quiet time. After eating, I built a fire in the wood stove, and it quickly warmed the cabin. The glow from the fire gave the room a comforting orange hue, and I found myself nodding off on the couch, my books slipping from my hands. I woke up with a start around 11:30, feeling disoriented, as if something had stirred me from a deep sleep. I rubbed my eyes, realizing how dark it had gotten. The only light came from the fire, flickering and crackling in the stove. The cabin was silent again, the kind of silence you get when you're in the middle of nowhere. I stretched, yawning, and decided to go outside for a bit of fresh air. I grabbed a jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the crisp air made me shiver. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of insects or animals, which struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at first. I figured maybe it was just the chill of the evening keeping everything still. The sky was clear, with a full moon casting pale light over the clearing in front of the cabin. It was beautiful, the kind of night you'd see in a movie. I stood there for a while, just taking in the peacefulness. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal in the distance, but then it came again, a low, deep growl. It was distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't a normal animal noise. I've been in the woods enough to know the sounds of deer, bears, and coyotes, but this was something else. The growl wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It had a guttural, unnatural quality to it, almost like a cross between a dog and a bear. I froze. I couldn't tell where it came from, but it was definitely close. My heart started to race. I looked around, trying to see anything moving in the shadows, but the moonlight barely cut through the thick trees. The woods felt deeper, darker, and more oppressive now. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe it was some kind of large animal, a bear or a wolf. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A set of footsteps, heavy, like something large was walking through the woods. Not the usual, lighter footsteps of a deer or smaller animal, but something far more deliberate. It was the kind of sound that could only come from something with mass, something big. My stomach twisted. Something was out there. Something was moving toward the cabin. I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me, trying to steady my breath. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Maybe a wolf or a coyote, maybe a bear. But no matter how much I told myself that, a deep feeling of dread settled over me. The growl echoed in my head, and the footsteps continued in my mind, thudding heavily in the silence. It was then that I heard it again, this time much closer. A scraping sound, like claws dragging against the bark of a tree, then a low snarl. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, my hands shaking as I turned it on. I crept to the window, trying to peer out into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees. Then, as I scanned the clearing, I saw movement, a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. It was large, too large to be any typical animal in the area. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, but I could see the shape of something standing upright, something that didn't look like a normal animal. It was hunched, its silhouette oddly human, but with the unmistakable head of a large, wolf-like creature. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. I had heard stories, of course, rumors about strange creatures in the woods, things that didn't make sense. Dogmen, they called it. A half-man, half-dog creature that some claimed to have seen in the deep woods of the Midwest. But I never took those stories seriously. I never thought they were real. Now, standing in that cabin, my breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The creature moved closer to the cabin. I could see its eyes now, glowing faintly in the dark like yellow orbs. It had the shape of a man, but with the head of a massive wolf, its fur thick and matted. Its body was covered in muscle, and its posture was wrong, too upright to be an animal, but too hunched to be fully human. It moved with a fluid grace, silently gliding across the ground, its eyes locked on the cabin. I backed away from the window, panic setting in. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Was it even safe to try? The creature was still out there, moving around the cabin now. It was circling, its growls deep and menacing. I could hear the sound of its claws scraping the ground, and I knew it was close. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I was miles away from the nearest town. No one would be able to help me. I was alone in this cabin with whatever this thing was. I needed to think, but my mind was racing. I thought about running for my car, but that was at least a quarter-mile away, and I'd never make it before the creature caught up with me. I couldn't even get outside to drive away. I'd have to find another way out. Then, I heard something that made my heart drop. A loud crash. The creature had slammed into the side of the cabin. I could hear the wood splintering. The thing was trying to get in. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands trembling, and I backed into the corner of the cabin. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to sit there and wait for it to break in. My only hope was that I could scare it off. I didn't know how, but I was going to try. I couldn't let it come inside. The creature growled again, the sound shaking the walls. It was right outside the door now, breathing heavily, its hot, rancid breath seeping through the cracks. I could hear its claws scratching against the wood as it paced, waiting. I raised the poker, ready to strike if it tried to break in. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. There was silence, complete and utter silence. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for it to make the next move. But it didn't. It was as if it had just vanished into the woods. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my eyes glued to the door. I didn't dare move. But when I finally dared to peek out the window again, I saw nothing. The creature was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. My mind raced and my nerves were shot. The next morning, I packed my things, grabbed the keys, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I've never gone back to that cabin. It still sits there, deep in the woods, waiting for the next person who thinks they're far enough from the world to escape. But I know better now. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a bear or a wolf. And I don't care what anyone says. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong. The rain had started hours ago, drenching the woods and the small cabin I had rented for the weekend. I hadn't planned to be alone, but my friends had backed out last minute, and I found myself driving up the winding roads to a cabin nestled deep in the forest. The place was secluded, so much so that the cell service barely reached. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Peaceful, quiet, away from everything. Just me and the woods. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold air against my face as I grabbed my bag from the back seat. The sky was nearly black with thick clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed in the hills. The cabin itself looked like something out of an old movie. Wooden walls, a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a chimney that puffed out a thin trail of smoke. I knew it was a bit old-fashioned, but it added to the charm, or so I thought. I figured I'd spend the next couple of days reading, maybe taking some walks through the woods, just enjoying the peace and quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and dust, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The living room had a couple of comfy chairs, a small couch, and a heavy wooden coffee table. A few old lamps cast soft light over the room, and the silence felt almost sacred. I locked the door behind me and set my bag on the couch, unzipping it to pull out a book. It was too early to sleep, but the weather outside was too wet for any outdoor activities. I poured myself a drink, wrapped myself in a blanket, and settled in for a quiet evening. The wind began picking up outside, whistling through the trees. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch creak or a gust of wind that made the cabin shake just slightly. It didn't bother me at first, but after a few hours, I noticed something. There was this strange, almost rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain hitting the roof either. It was a scratching sound, slow and deliberate, like something dragging its claws against wood. Came in fits, sometimes loud and sometimes faint, like whatever was making it was trying to find a rhythm. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just an animal or maybe the old wood of the cabin settling. But then it happened again, closer this time, and it didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was a dragging noise, like something was crawling across the porch, slow and deliberate, its claws scraping the wood with each movement. I got up, walking over to the window. The porch was covered in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire behind me. I couldn't see anything through the rain-smeared glass, but I felt that cold, uneasy feeling crawl down my spine. Something was out there, I was sure of it. I stood at the window for a few moments, trying to steady my breath and calm my racing heart. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, something harmless. I turned away from the window and walked back into the living room. But as I did, the scratching noise came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the door that led out to the woods. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could be making such a sound. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and hesitated for a moment, but something in the back of my mind told me I had to check. I couldn't just ignore it. With the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark, I moved toward the back door. The sound stopped the moment I reached it, leaving me standing there in an unnerving silence. I slowly opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain had picked up, and the wind howled through the trees, but there was nothing unusual in sight. Just darkness and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the landscape. I stepped outside, my boots sinking slightly into the wet ground as I shone the light around the porch and yard. Nothing. I stood there for a moment longer, the cold wetness of the rain seeping into my clothes. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. like I was being watched. But when I glanced around, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the storm. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and made my way back to the living room, still feeling that strange, heavy feeling. The scratching noise returned just as I sat down. This time it was much closer, almost inside the cabin. My pulse quickened, and I stood up again, the light of the flashlight trembling in my hand. It was coming from the other side of the room. Slowly, I walked toward the source of the sound, and that's when I saw it. A shape, just on the edge of the beam of light, in the corner near the bookshelf. It was low to the ground, the outline barely visible in the darkness, but I could see it clearly now. It was a creature, skinny and small, but its limbs were unnaturally long, and it moved with a jerky, twitching motion. The thing was crawling, dragging its body across the floor as though it was struggling to lift itself. Its head was disturbingly large in proportion to its body, with skin stretched tight across its skull. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were small, dark pits, like black holes staring at me with an almost unnatural intelligence. My throat went dry, and I froze, every instinct in me screaming to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature stopped crawling and turned its head toward me, as though it had been aware of me all along. Its mouth, if you could call it that, was slightly open, revealing jagged teeth that seemed too sharp for its face. It made a soft, rasping sound, like it was trying to speak, but it couldn't. The room seemed to close in around me as I watched it move, slow and deliberate, dragging its body closer to me. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen, and I realized just how wrong I was about this place being peaceful. The thing was terrifying in a way I couldn't describe, a kind of primal fear that had me rooted to the spot. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but I couldn't look away from those black eyes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should run or hide or try to fight it off. But then, in an instant, it moved. It crawled across the floor faster than I could process, its limbs clicking on the wooden floor like the sound of bones breaking. It was coming toward me, its head twitching, its body contorting unnaturally. I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the door, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, feel it, closing in behind me. I shoved the door open with one hand, slamming it behind me as I ran into the rain-soaked night, not even knowing which direction I was headed. I didn't stop running until I was out in the woods, the rain pouring down, the thunder deafening. My feet slipped on the muddy ground, but I kept going, pushing through the trees, through the storm, anything to put distance between me and whatever that thing was. The rain soaked my clothes, but I didn't care. Every step felt like an eternity, but I couldn't stop. Not until I found the road, not until I knew I was safe. Eventually, I made it to a small clearing, gasping for breath, drenched and shivering. I looked around, the darkness pressing in around me, but there was no sign of the creature. There was only the storm and the deafening silence that followed. The night felt too quiet, like I was hearing the world through a thick layer of fog. My pulse still raced, but I didn't see or hear anything. I was still in shock, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. I took a few more steps, then looked back toward the cabin, now just a faint silhouette in the distance. I could barely see it through the trees. The thought of going back in there, even in daylight, made my stomach turn. The creature, whatever it was still out there. I knew it, but I had made it out. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and realized that there was no way I could stay. No way I could go back to that cabin. The thing, whatever it was still there, lurking in the shadows, and I wasn't about to find out what it wanted. It was a cold Friday evening when I arrived at the cabin. The place was secluded, tucked away in a dense patch of woods, far enough that the nearest neighbor was a good half-hour drive away. I had rented it for the weekend, hoping to escape the noise and busyness of city life. The cabin itself wasn't much old wood, weathered by years of harsh winters and sun. The porch creaked underfoot, and the scent of pine mixed with the earthy smell of moss and damp leaves filled the air. It felt cozy, like it was meant for solitude. I stepped out of my car and stretched. The wind was picking up, rustling the branches above, making it sound like whispers. The cabin looked like something out of an old horror movie, the kind where you'd expect things to go wrong at any moment. I pushed the thought aside, reminding myself that I was here to relax. The first few hours were peaceful. I unloaded my bags, lit a fire in the small stone fireplace inside, and settled into an old armchair with a book. The rain started in the late afternoon, soft at first, then heavier as evening approached. By nightfall, the storm was in full swing, with thunder rumbling in the distance and lightning flashing every few seconds. The isolation, however, started to creep into my thoughts. The sound of the storm outside made the cabin feel even more remote. The thought that no one was within shouting distance, in case something went wrong, sent a cold shiver through me. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of every creak, every groan the old house made as it settled. I turned the lights down low, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I should have gone with friends, I thought. It was too quiet, too lonely for just one person. I decided to take a walk outside to clear my head. The rain had slowed, and the wind seemed to have calmed. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The woods around the cabin were thick, full of tall trees and dense brush. I shone the flashlight ahead, its beam flickering as it bounced off the wet branches and leaves. The forest felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. The branches above swayed gently, casting long shadows across the ground. I walked a little ways into the woods, letting the crunch of leaves underfoot fill my ears. It was dark, but the flashlight illuminated just enough to make me feel like I could see everything and nothing at the same time. I didn't know what it was at first, just a blur in the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The shape moved quickly through the trees, too fast for a normal animal. It was large, but its movements were erratic, almost unnatural. I snapped my head toward the spot, but there was nothing there, only the rain and wind rustling the trees. I stood still for a while, trying to listen, trying to see if it would come back. After a few moments of silence, I dismissed it. Probably just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. I took another step forward, then another. That's when I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, coming from deeper in the forest. It wasn't the normal call of an animal. It was more like a growl, but there was something wrong about it, something off. It sounded like it came from something much bigger, much more menacing. I instinctively turned back toward the cabin, my heart rate picking up. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. The growl, deep and throaty, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I spun around, flashlight sweeping through the trees. My breath came out in short, fast bursts, my pulse pounding in my ears. I thought I saw movement again, but it was too quick. Couldn't make it out. Suddenly, a rustling noise came from just behind me, to the left. I whipped the flashlight in that direction, and for a split second, I saw it. Something huge, moving low to the ground, its eyes reflecting the light like twin orbs in the darkness. It was dog-like, but wrong. Its body was longer than any dog I'd ever seen. Its limbs twisted and too long for its frame. The fur was matted and dark, soaked with rain. It was low to the ground, almost slithering as it moved through the brush, its eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait to see more. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, not caring about the trail, not caring if I slipped or stumbled. I just had to get back to the cabin. My feet pounded the wet earth, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me, I heard the heavy, pounding footsteps of the creature. It wasn't running, but it was getting closer. I could hear it breathing, heavy and labored, but almost rhythmic. It wasn't far behind now, and I could feel the weight of its presence like a dark shadow looming over me. I burst out of the trees and back onto the porch of the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door and stood there for a few seconds, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Outside, the storm raged on, but I could hear something else now. soft scratching noises at the door, like claws scraping against wood. I stepped back, eyes wide. It was there. It hadn't gone away. I backed up, grabbing the chair by the fireplace and wedging it under the door handle, just in case. But I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever this thing was, it was much stronger than I was. I was alone, and there was nothing I could do to fight it off. The scratching stopped. I waited, listening to the silence. The sound of the wind outside was the only thing I could hear now. I tried to convince myself it was gone, that I had imagined it, but I knew better. There was something out there, something that wanted me. Hours passed. I don't know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, barely even breathing. The storm eventually died down, and the silence of the night settled in. I didn't sleep, couldn't. In the morning, I checked the door. There were deep gouges in the wood where the creature's claws had scratched it. The marks were unmistakable, but there was no sign of it. No tracks, no blood, nothing. It was as if the creature had vanished without a trace. I didn't stay another night. I packed up and left as soon as I could, leaving the cabin behind. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the sound of its growl, the way its eyes glowed in the dark, or how it followed me through the woods, relentless. Whatever it was, I hope it stays in the woods, where it belongs. I don't plan to go back. Not ever. It was the kind of place that felt a bit too isolated for comfort, but that was part of the appeal. My cabin, a small, weathered structure nestled at the edge of a thick patch of woods, had been my retreat for years. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace and quiet. It was my getaway from everything. Work, stress, the city. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The cabin itself was simple, made of dark wood with a slanted roof that seemed to sag just a little in the middle. It had a front porch, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen. The kind of place you could close off for the winter or live in year-round if you had the guts to brave the isolation. I'd spent many weekends there, but this particular weekend was different. I hadn't planned on it being different, but it was. I arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, the kind of colors that make you pause and take a deep breath. I always felt a sense of calm when I arrived, but this time, something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt thick, almost like it was waiting for something. I parked my truck in the gravel lot near the cabin and grabbed my things. The cabin didn't look any different than it had the last time I'd been here a couple of weeks ago. The same peeling paint, the same overgrown yard. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds, which usually filled the air with their calls, seemed to be missing. But that wasn't unusual. Maybe it was just that time of year. Still, there was a feeling that lingered, something uncomfortable that I couldn't shake. I unloaded my gear and headed inside. The door creaked as it opened, the familiar sound somehow comforting. The inside of the cabin smelled of old wood and the faint scent of wood smoke from the last time I'd used the fireplace. I set my bags down, unloaded the cooler, and started a fire. As the flames flickered, casting long shadows across the room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of silence pressing in on me. I shrugged it off and settled in for the evening. I was planning to spend the weekend just relaxing, no work, no distractions. Just reading, cooking, and maybe going for a hike or two. But as the night wore on, I found it harder to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. Every time the wind rustled the trees outside, I couldn't help but jump. It wasn't a normal jump, like when a car backfires or a door slams. It was deeper, more instinctive, like something inside me was telling me to stay alert. I kept the fire going, too nervous to turn off the lights. I've never been a paranoid person, but tonight, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation. After all, it had been a while since I'd spent a night alone in the cabin, and I was probably just getting into my head. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The air was cold, but the fire had heated the cabin nicely. I slipped under the covers, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I thought I heard something in the distance, maybe a snap of a twig, but I dismissed it as nothing. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking I heard something outside. A low rumble, the trees moving in a way that seemed unnatural. It wasn't until I heard it again, closer this time, that I sat straight up in bed. A knock, not a knock on the door, but a thud, like something was hitting the side of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. It couldn't have been a person. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. But what else could it be? I grabbed my flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand, and slowly crept to the window. I peered out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I forced myself to breathe and told myself I was just being paranoid. The knock or thud was probably just the wind, or maybe a branch falling against the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go outside and check around the cabin. If it was a wild animal, at least I could figure out what was going on. I grabbed my boots, slipped into a jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was frigid, and the ground beneath me was soft with the moisture from earlier rain. I shone the flashlight around the perimeter of the cabin, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the wind whispering through the branches. Still uneasy, I made my way around the back of the cabin. The thud I'd heard earlier could have been from a tree branch or something falling, but there was nothing there now. No sign of anything out of place. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to calm myself, but then I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't coming from the side of the cabin. It was from the woods, deeper in the trees, somewhere far beyond the reach of my flashlight. A low, rhythmic noise, like something heavy was dragging along the forest floor. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was no way that was an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something or someone was out there. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. I could feel the unease curling in my gut, growing by the second. I had two choices: go back inside and lock the door or investigate. Part of me wanted to run back inside and call it a night, but another part of me, the part that had always been the curious, adventurous one, wanted to find out what was out there. I chose to investigate. I stepped off the porch and into the woods, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The noise was still there, but it was getting louder now. It was as if something was moving closer, dragging along the ground. My heart raced in my chest. Every step felt heavier, like the air was thick with something I couldn't name. I pushed forward, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I reached the edge of the forest. The sound had stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. It felt wrong. Too still, like the forest was holding its breath. My mind raced through possible explanations. Wild animal? Person? Something else? But nothing made sense. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but as I did, I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a figure stood. It was too far to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person. I stopped, breath caught in my throat. Was it a hunter? Someone lost? Or something else? The figure didn't move. It stood there, just watching. I stood frozen, too scared to move, unsure of what to do. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and for a brief moment, the figure was gone, vanished into the night. I didn't wait to see if it came back. My instincts kicked in, and I ran back to the cabin, stumbling over the uneven ground. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, but I knew I wasn't going out there again tonight. I spent the rest of the night on edge, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and the silence outside felt oppressive. But nothing else happened. The rest of the night passed without incident. The morning came, and I was relieved to see daylight again. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. Something about that night had unsettled me to my core. It wasn't the noise or the figure in the woods. It was the feeling of being watched, the feeling of not being alone, even though there was no one there. I packed up my things, double-checked the cabin, and drove off, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. As I left, I took one last look at the woods. The trees seemed peaceful now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lurking there, waiting. I haven't been back since. Something in the woods that night wasn't right. Maybe I'll return one day, but not anytime soon. The cabin will still be there, waiting, and I'll be ready for whatever's next. I've had my cabin for a few years now. It's tucked away deep in the woods, far enough that you don't hear any cars or people unless you make the drive up yourself. I've always liked it like that, quiet, away from all the noise of the city. It's an old place, built decades ago, and you can tell it's seen its share of weather and age. The wood is dark, weathered from years of rain, snow, and sun. Creaks in places, the kind of creaking you can't ignore when you're alone. The kind that makes you wonder if it's the cabin itself or something else that's moving in the dark. I came up to the cabin that weekend by myself, looking for some solitude. I'd been working non-stop for months, and the constant rush of the city was starting to get to me. I'd been here a dozen times before, but for some reason, this time felt different. Maybe it was because the sky was heavier that day, more overcast than I was used to. There was an edge to the air, as if something was about to happen, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I didn't think much of it at the time, just focused on getting the place ready for the weekend. I've always been careful about making sure everything is in order when I get here. I check the windows, make sure the locks are all secure, and the wood stove is ready to go. There's something about the feeling of being prepared that makes me feel more at ease in this place. It's a small cabin, just one room with a loft upstairs, but it has everything I need. Comfortable bed, wood-burning stove, a chair by the window where I like to sit with a book or just watch the trees sway outside. A fireplace in the corner, old but reliable. But there's something else too, something I can't describe, something that makes it feel different every time I'm here alone. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't howling, but it was persistent, rattling the trees outside, sending leaves and branches swaying against the windows. I always sleep with the windows cracked open to let in the cool air. But that night, the wind sounded like it was trying to whisper to me. The sound of it whistling through the cracks, the subtle thumping as branches hit the cabin walls, made the place feel alive, like the cabin was breathing with me. I shrugged it off as just the wind, nothing more. I got into bed around 10, reading a little before I turned the light out. The fire had died down, leaving only the soft glow of the embers, and the only other light came from the moon shining through the window. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. I could hear the wind howling more now, and the occasional thump or creak from the cabin itself. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but tonight it felt louder, more insistent. I tossed and turned for a while, trying to get comfortable. The bed creaked, the wooden floor below it groaning with each shift of my weight. The feeling of being alone hit me harder than usual, and for some reason, it made my skin itch. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but there was something in the air, something that felt wrong. I told myself it was just the isolation, just the way things seem when you're out here by yourself, far away from everything. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't anything loud, but it was clear enough to stir me from my sleep. A soft, deliberate tapping. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting the window, but then I realized the sound was coming from the roof. I lay there, listening, waiting for it to happen again. The tapping continued, slow but steady, like someone was walking on the roof, each step a muffled thud. My heart skipped. It was too slow to be an animal, and the roof was steep enough that I doubted any person could walk on it without slipping off. The wind picked up, and I could hear the trees swaying violently outside, but the tapping was distinct, too consistent to be anything natural. I tried to brush it off. It's just an animal, I thought, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like something deliberate, something moving with purpose. My mind raced, imagining a person on the roof, trying to make their way quietly across the top of the cabin. I threw the covers off and crept to the window, peeking out into the dark. The moonlight illuminated the trees around the cabin, but there was no one there. I couldn't see a thing moving on the roof, and the tapping had stopped. My stomach churned, but I convinced myself that it was just my nerves getting the best of me. Maybe it had been a branch or something else. I went back to bed, telling myself I was being foolish. I pulled the blankets tight and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep. But the tapping came again. This time it was louder, more urgent, and it seemed to be moving, like whatever was on the roof was walking across it, shifting positions. I froze, listening, every nerve on edge. My chest tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just some animal. It was too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and slowly opened the door, shining the beam out into the darkness. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear was my own breathing. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hitting me like a slap, and shone the light up at the roof. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the roof, trying to make sense of what I had heard. But there was nothing. The cabin was silent again, and I had to admit that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or some animal playing tricks on my mind. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. It lingered, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. Not out of the ordinary, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin. The night dragged on, and eventually, I managed to fall asleep. But when morning came, I woke up feeling even more unsettled. The cabin, which had always felt like a refuge before, now felt like it was closing in on me. I spent the day cleaning up, trying to keep my mind busy. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed up my things that afternoon and decided to leave early. The drive back was uneventful, but I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat or someone following behind. Sounds stupid now, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I wasn't sure how to explain it. It wasn't like I had seen anything, but the noises, they had been real. Later, when I had the chance to go back to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were scratches on the roof, fresh and deep, like something had dug into it. Maybe I'll never know what really happened that night, but one thing is for sure, that cabin won't ever feel the same. I haven't been back there alone since. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off, My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened, no tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again.